I first felt their presence in the manufactorum tunnels where I worked, deep beneath the hive's industrial sectors, where the air tasted of oil and rust, and the accumulated sweat of 10,000 laborers who had breathed the same recycled atmosphere for generations. My name was Corvus Thane, Shift Supervisor 3rd Class, assigned to the coolant regulation systems that kept the plasma forges from melting through the hive's foundation. It was honest work, mindless work, the kind of labor that filled your hours without requiring thought, that allowed your mind to drift while your hands performed their practiced routines of valve checks and pressure readings, and the endless documentation that the administratum required as proof that systems functioned as designed even when those systems had been failing incrementally for decades. The first sign was subtle, so subtle I dismissed it as fatigue, or the after effects of breathing too much recycled air, thick with chemical particulates. The tunnel where I performed my rounds, a maintenance corridor that ran for 3 kilometers beneath the forge complex, its walls slick with condensation and mineral deposits, began to feel different. Not visibly different, not in any way I could point to or document in my shift reports. But the quality of the space had changed, had acquired a presence that made the back of my neck prickle, that made my breath come slightly faster, that made me pause mid-step to listen for sounds that were not there or were too quiet to properly hear. The air vibrated. That was the only way I could describe it, though the description was inadequate, failed to capture the sensation of something wrong with the fundamental nature of the space I occupied. The tunnel had always hummed with the background noise of industry, the grinding of gears in distant machinery, the hiss of steam through ancient pipes, the low thrumming of the plasma forges that operated continuously because shutting them down would require resources the manufactorum could not afford, and time that production quotas did not permit. But beneath that familiar symphony of mechanical noise, I began to perceive something else, a rhythm that matched no machinery I knew. A pulse that felt organic rather than mechanical, that suggested heartbeat or breathing, or the rhythmic contractions of something alive. I reported it to my superior, Foreman Grecht, during the shift change briefing when we gathered in the cramped office that smelled of old coffee and stale incense. He listened with the expression of a man who had heard every complaint, every concern, every excuse that workers could manufacture to explain failures or request modifications to their assignments. When I finished describing the sensation, the wrongness of the air, the pulse that had no source, the feeling of being observed by something that remained invisible, he marked my report as possible fatigue-induced hallucination and recommended I take a double dose of stimulants and report for psychological evaluation if the symptoms persisted beyond the next shift cycle. The tunnels play tricks, he said, his augmetic eye clicking as it focused on my face with the cold precision of a targeting system. The sounds echo strangely, the air pressure fluctuates, the lighting creates shadows that move when you're not looking directly at them. You've been down there for 8 years, Thane, you should know this by now. The mind sees patterns that aren't there because patterns are comforting, because randomness is frightening, because we're hardwired by evolution to detect threats even when threats don't exist. Take your stimulants, do your rounds, stop wasting my time with ghost stories. I took the stimulants, bitter tablets that dissolved on the tongue and left a metallic aftertaste that lingered for hours, and returned to my rounds, descending through the access shafts into the tunnel system that was my responsibility, my domain, my prison of routine. The stimulants sharpened my focus, made the shadows more distinct, made the mechanical sounds clearer and more differentiated. But they did nothing to eliminate the sensation of wrongness, the feeling that something in the tunnel had changed in ways that transcended physical alteration, that occupied space differently than it had before, that was present in a manner that normal matter was not present. The pulse grew stronger. Or perhaps my perception of it grew more acute, my consciousness tuning into frequencies it had previously filtered out as irrelevant noise. I found myself stopping during my rounds, standing motionless in the tunnel, listening with concentration that was almost meditative, trying to locate the source of the vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that resonated in my bones rather than my ears, that felt less like sound and more like the sensation of standing near something vast and patient and utterly alien. Every clang of metal, every impact of tool against pipe, every fall of dropped equipment, every slam of access hatch echoed too long. The acoustics of the tunnel should have absorbed sound quickly, should have deadened noise in the confined space choked with pipes and cables and the accumulated industrial detritus of centuries. But sounds lingered, stretched, resonated with harmonics that should not exist, as if the tunnel had become an instrument, a chamber designed to amplify and extend every vibration into something that approached music or communication or meaning. I began to feel watched. Not by cameras. The surveillance systems in the tunnels were ancient and mostly non-functional, maintained in records as operational to satisfy regulatory requirements, but actually dark and corroded, their lenses long since fogged with condensation and chemical deposits. Not by co-workers. I performed my rounds alone, the only human presence in 3 kilometers of tunnel, isolation being standard protocol because workers in groups became inefficient, became social, became more focused on conversation than on the mindless repetition of inspection routines. No, the watching came from something else, something that occupied the spaces between the pipes and cables, that lurked in the shadows, that were too deep to be mere absence of light, that observed with attention that felt predatory and curious, and terribly, impossibly patient. I felt its gaze on my back when I turned to check pressure readings, felt it studying my movements when I knelt to examine a valve that showed signs of stress, fracture, felt it learning me, memorizing my patterns, my routines, my vulnerabilities. My fear became a physical thing, a scent I could almost smell, the sour chemical stink of adrenaline-saturated sweat, the acidic tang of stress hormones, the particular odor of a body preparing for flight or fight against a threat it could not identify or comprehend. And I sensed, with the terrible intuition of prey recognizing predator, that the thing in the tunnel was aware of my fear, was feeding on it, was growing stronger or more present or more real in direct proportion to my escalating terror. I tried to rationalize. Fear was biological response, was evolutionary adaptation, was the product of neural pathways designed to keep organisms alive in environments full of actual threats. The tunnel contained hazards, corrosive chemicals, unstable pressure systems, radiation leakage from improperly shielded components. My fear was proportional response to real danger, was my subconscious detecting warning signs that my conscious mind had not yet processed, was entirely explicable through materialist frameworks that required no supernatural intervention. But rationalization failed to eliminate the sensation, failed to explain the pulse that had no mechanical source, failed to account for the echoes that lasted too long, failed to address the fundamental wrongness that permeated the tunnel and grew more pronounced with each shift I worked. And beneath the rationalization, in the parts of my mind that predated education and indoctrination and the comfortable lies of materialism, I knew the truth that I could not speak aloud without being dismissed as delusional. Something from elsewhere had noticed me, had marked me, had begun the slow process of crossing the boundary between its realm and mine. I felt watched even in the deepest crowds of the hive, in the habitation sectors where millions of humans pressed together in vertical kilometers of housing, where privacy was impossible and anonymity was guaranteed by sheer density of population. I would stand in the transit stations waiting for the elevators that would carry me to my assigned residential level, surrounded by workers and functionaries and the endless stream of humanity that flowed through the hive's arterial passages, and I would feel it, the attention, the gaze, the presence that observed me through mechanisms that had nothing to do with eyes or sight or any sense that baseline human neurology acknowledged. The crowds reacted to my fear, not consciously, not explicitly, but with the subtle recoiling of animals detecting sickness in a herd member, detecting weakness, detecting the mark of predation that made me dangerous by association. They gave me space in the packed transit cars, left gaps around me that should not exist in environments where every centimeter of standing room was occupied, where bodies pressed together until breathing became collective effort. They avoided my gaze, turned their faces away, made the sign of the aquila when they thought I wasn't looking, that double-headed eagle gesture that was supposed to invoke the emperor's protection but which I had come to recognize as apotropaic magic, as the superstitious warding of people who sensed something wrong but could not articulate what or why. My sleep deteriorated. Not from insomnia. I slept easily, collapsed into unconsciousness from exhaustion at the end of each shift, but from dreams that were not dreams, that felt more like visitations, like my consciousness leaving my body to travel to places that should not exist, to encounter things that wore shapes drawn from my memories and fears, but animated by intelligence that was fundamentally other. I would wake gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat that smelled wrong, that carried chemical signatures my body should not produce, that suggested my metabolism was being altered, rewritten, prepared for something I could not name. I tried to pray. I had never been particularly devout. My faith was the background radiation of imperial culture, the habitual recitation of liturgies learned in childhood, the comfortable assumption that the emperor watched and protected and cared about the fates of individual humans, even when all evidence suggested his attention was fixed on grander scales, on star systems and sectors, and the vast strategic movements of crusades and wars. But desperation drives devotion. Fear compels faith. And I found myself kneeling before the small shrine in my compartment, a cheap metal aquila mounted on the wall above my bed, its surface tarnished and dented, whispering prayers whose words I half remembered, begging for protection I did not truly believe would come. The prayers felt hollow, felt like shouting into void, felt like words that traveled no further than the walls of my tiny compartment before falling back unheard and unanswered. Or worse, I felt them being intercepted, felt my faith being examined by something curious and amused, felt my devotion being studied the way a scientist might study the death throes of an insect, with detached interest in the patterns of suffering but no capacity for mercy or intervention. The warp was stirring. I did not know this word yet, did not have the vocabulary to describe what was happening, did not possess the theological or metaphysical framework that would have allowed me to understand that my experience was not unique, was not personal, was part of a larger pattern that the Imperium fought to suppress and deny, and never acknowledged to the general population because acknowledgement would create panic, would undermine the comfortable materialism that allowed citizens to function without existential terror, would reveal that the universe was not the orderly machine we pretended it was, but was instead a thin membrane stretched over chaos, over a realm where consciousness and matter were not separate, where thought could become flesh and desire could reshape reality, and where things existed that hungered for human souls with an appetite that was both eternal and insatiable. But I felt it stirring. Felt reality thinning around me, felt the boundaries between what is and what should not be growing permeable, felt myself becoming beacon or conduit or sacrifice, felt the attention of something vast and patient and unutterably alien focusing on me with an intensity that made my bones ache and my teeth hurt and my vision blur at the edges where shadows moved with purpose and intention. I stood in the tunnel during my shift, stood motionless, my data slate forgotten in my hand, my rounds abandoned, my responsibilities dissolved by the overwhelming certainty that something was about to happen, that the slow stalking that had characterized the previous weeks was entering a new phase, that patience was ending and action was beginning, and that whatever came next would be worse than the watching, worse than the fear, worse than any fate my imagination could construct, because my imagination was limited by human experience, and what approached came from beyond humanity, from the spaces between spaces, from the dark that was not absence of light but presence of something else. The air vibrated. The pulse intensified. The echoes grew longer. And in the deepest shadow at the far end of the tunnel, where the emergency lighting had failed years ago and maintenance had never been authorized to replace it, something moved. Not with the movement of physical matter. With the movement of concept, of possibility, of potential becoming actual, of the boundary between here and elsewhere thinning until it was gossamer, until it was nothing, until something that should not exist in this reality reached through and touched the material universe with appendages that were not hands, with awareness that was not mind, with hunger that was not appetite but something far older and far more terrible. My fear became a scent. I could smell it now, could detect the chemical signature of my own terror as clearly as I could smell the oil and rust and human waste that characterized the tunnel's usual atmosphere. And I understood, with the terrible clarity of someone who has already lost but has not yet stopped running, that my fear was not mine alone anymore, was not private experience, but was broadcast, was signal, was beacon calling across dimensions to something that fed on fear, that grew strong through terror, that had marked me as prey and was now closing distance, was approaching, was arriving. I ran, dropped my data slate, abandoned my post. fled back toward the access shaft with breath ragged and heart hammering, and the sensation of pursuit growing stronger even though no footsteps followed. Even though the tunnel behind me was as empty as it had always been, even though nothing visible gave chase. But I felt it following. Felt it moving through spaces that were not physical space. Felt it tracking me through the spoor of my fear. Felt it learning the taste of my terror so that it would always be able to find me regardless of where I ran or how I tried to hide. The hunt had begun, and I was prey. And somewhere in the dark behind the veil of reality, something smiled with a mouth that had too many teeth, something laughed with a sound that was not sound, something reached toward me with intention that was both alien and utterly, terribly clear. It wanted me. Not for food, not for purpose, but for the exquisite prolongation of my suffering, for the entertainment value of my fear, for the pure aesthetic pleasure of watching consciousness trapped and terrified and aware that no salvation would come, that the Emperor did not hear, that the Imperium did not care, that I was alone with my hunter, and would remain alone until the hunt concluded, in whatever horror passed for mercy, in the minds of things that existed beyond mercy, beyond morality, beyond any framework that made suffering meaningful or death a release. I reached the access shaft. I climbed. I emerged into the better-lit corridors of the manufactorum's upper levels where other workers moved through their routines, where normalcy continued, where the day's labor proceeded with the grinding inevitability of imperial efficiency. But I carried the mark now, carried the scent, carried the attention of something that would not stop, would not forget, would not be satisfied with anything except my complete consumption. This was only the beginning. The watching phase was over. The hunting had commenced. The first claw marks appeared on my dorm wall 3 nights after I fled the tunnel. 3 nights of fitful sleep interrupted by dreams that felt more like reconnaissance than mere nightmare. I woke at some dark hour between shifts. The chronometer on my data slate claimed it was 3:47, though time had become unreliable, elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that suggested my perception was no longer synchronized with objective reality, and found myself staring at the wall above my bunk, at marks that had not been there when I collapsed into unconsciousness 4 hours earlier. They were deep, impossibly deep for the thin plasteel panels that formed the walls of worker habitation units. 4 parallel grooves, each one carved into the metal as if the material had been soft wax rather than industrial alloy, as if whatever had made them possessed strength that transcended physical force, that operated through mechanisms I had no framework to understand. The grooves were precise, deliberate, too uniform to be the work of vermin or vandals, or the slow decay that characterized every surface in the underhive. They were marks of intention, of intelligence, of something that had reached through the wall from elsewhere and left its signature where I would see it upon waking, where I could not dismiss it as dream or hallucination, or the products of exhausted consciousness. I reached out, my hand trembling, my breath held, and ran my fingers along the grooves. Heat. They radiated heat that should not have lingered, that should have dissipated hours ago if they had been made by any physical process I understood. The metal was warm to touch, almost feverish, as if the act of carving had introduced thermal energy that refused to bleed away, that sustained itself through principles that violated thermodynamics, and suggested the marks were not merely physical, but were anchored in the wall through connection to somewhere else, somewhere hotter, somewhere that operated under different rules. My fingers came away clean but tingling, nerves firing in patterns that suggested I had touched more than just heated metal, that I had made contact with something that left impressions on consciousness rather than just flesh. I sat on my bunk for the remaining hour before my shift began, staring at the marks, trying to convince myself they had been there all along, that I simply hadn't noticed them before, that my fear was manufacturing significance from random damage, from structural stress, from the accumulated wear of a HAB unit that had housed thousands of workers over decades and was maintained only to the minimum standards that prevented complete collapse. But I knew. I knew with the certainty of someone who has been marked, who has been claimed, who has moved from the category of observer to the category of participant in something that should not exist but did, that was happening to me regardless of my belief or understanding or desperate attempts to rationalize away evidence that contradicted the comfortable materialism I had been raised to accept as truth. I went to my shift. I performed my duties, Though I avoided the tunnels, claimed equipment malfunction that required me to work in the upper maintenance levels where other workers were present, where witnesses existed, where I could maintain the fiction of normalcy through the social pressure of being observed by others who expected normal behavior. But the marks followed me, or rather, my awareness of them followed me, colonized my thoughts, made concentration impossible as I compulsively checked walls and surfaces, looking for new signs, new evidence, new proof that the boundary between my reality and whatever lay beyond was continuing to thin. My co-workers noticed. They had been avoiding me since I emerged from the tunnels 3 days prior, since whatever I carried, whatever mark or taint or psychic residue became perceptible to their animal hindbrain, to the parts of human consciousness that predated civilization and still remembered when humans were prey, when darkness held genuine threats, when survival required detecting danger through subtle cues that conscious reasoning could not process. But now their avoidance became explicit, became social protocol, became the kind of systematic exclusion that no one acknowledged but everyone participated in. They stepped back when I approached. Not dramatically, these were subtle movements, casual adjustments of position that might have been coincidental, except they occurred with absolute consistency, every time, without fail. They stopped conversations when I came within earshot, their words trailing off into silence that lasted until I had passed, until I was far enough away that my presence no longer contaminated the social space. They did not make eye contact, did not respond when I spoke, treated me as if I had already crossed some threshold into non-existence, as if acknowledging me would create connection that might allow whatever pursued me to notice them, to mark them, to expand its hunting ground beyond the single prey it had already chosen. And they prayed. I saw their lips moving in silent recitation of liturgies, saw their hands forming the aquila in gestures that were barely visible but unmistakable, saw them touching the holy symbols and purity seals that decorated their workstations and personal effects. All those small totems of faith that the Imperium encouraged as protection against spiritual corruption, as psychological armor against the knowledge that darkness was real and safety was illusion. And the Emperor's protection extended only to those whose suffering served strategic purpose. The whispers began on the 4th day, not loud enough to be confronted, not clear enough to be reported, but persistent, ubiquitous, the background radiation of social judgment that told me I had been classified as contaminated, as dangerous, as something to be isolated, until whatever afflicted me either resolved or consumed me completely. I heard fragments touched, marked, damned, words spoken too quietly for attribution but loud enough for me to know they were about me, were spreading through the worker population, were establishing the social architecture of my exclusion. I tried to report it. During shift change, I went to the administrative processing office, a cramped room staffed by a functionary whose augmetic implants had replaced most of his face with machinery that gave him the appearance of efficiency without the burden of empathy or judgment. I described the marks, the heat that lingered, the growing sense that something was stalking me through dimensions I could not perceive. I showed him images I had captured on my data slate, pictures of the claw marks that looked less convincing in digital format than they did in person, that appeared as mere scratches, as damage that could have been caused by anything. He examined the images with clicking optical implants that cycled through different spectrums, analyzing the data with mechanical precision. His verdict was immediate, final, delivered in a synthesized voice that carried no inflection, no acknowledgement of my distress. Classified as delusional hazard exposure. Recommendation: increased work rotation to prevent psychological fixation. Psychological evaluation scheduled for next standard month. Claim dismissed. Next. The bureaucratic coldness chilled me more than the demon's attention. At least the thing hunting me acknowledged my existence, noticed me, considered me significant enough to pursue. The Imperium's response was worse, was the casual dismissal of someone whose suffering was inconvenient, whose claims were outside acceptable parameters, whose experience did not fit into the categories that the administrative system was designed to process. I was not being rejected because my claims were investigated and found wanting. I was being rejected because investigating would require resources, would require acknowledging that standard procedures were insufficient, would require admitting that something existed beyond the materialist framework the Imperium's lower bureaucracy operated within. If the Imperium would not believe me, would not help me, would not even acknowledge that my experience was real, then I was already lost. Not lost to the thing hunting me that was inevitable, was merely matter of time, but lost to the system I had trusted to protect me, to provide structure, to offer sanctuary in exchange for compliance and labor and faith. The betrayal was worse than the fear. The fear was at least honest, was appropriate response to genuine threat. The betrayal was the discovery that the protection I had believed in was conditional, was reserved for those whose suffering was convenient, whose pleas fit into forms that bureaucracy could process. I returned to my hab unit after shift, exhausted not from labor but from the constant vigilance of being hunted, from the psychological weight of maintaining composure while my reality crumbled, from the effort of performing normalcy when every moment felt like the last moment before something terrible happened. The marks on my wall had multiplied. The original 4 grooves were still present, still radiating that impossible heat, but they had been joined by others, by patterns that covered half the wall, that formed shapes I recognized at the edges of my vision, but which resolved into meaningless scratches when I looked directly at them. The shapes writhed. I sat on my bunk, staring at the wall, and the marks moved, shifted, rearranged themselves into configurations that suggested meaning, suggested language, suggested communication from something that was trying to speak across the barrier that separated its realm from mine. I could not read what they said, or rather, I could not read them with my conscious mind, but some deeper part of me, the animal brain, the limbic system, the parts of consciousness that processed fear and threat and danger understood perfectly, translated the writhing marks into pure emotional content. You are mine, you will be taken, your flight is entertainment, your fear is delicious. Continue running, it pleases us. Night after night, the marks multiplied. They spread beyond the wall above my bunk, crawled across the ceiling, descended the opposite wall, began appearing on surfaces they should not be able to reach: the underside of my bunk, the interior of my locker, the screen of my data slate when I woke to check the time. They were not always the same marks. They evolved, grew more complex, began incorporating symbols that resembled but were not identical to the imperial script I had learned in basic education, that looked like corrupted versions of holy iconography, of prayers written backward or inside out, or in dimensions that human writing was never meant to occupy. I tried to remove them, scraped at the grooves with tools from my maintenance kit, tried to fill them with sealant, tried to cover them with sheets and cloth, and anything that would hide them from my sight. But the marks could not be eliminated, could not be covered, persisted through every attempt at erasure, as if they existed on multiple levels simultaneously, as if destroying the physical manifestation did nothing to the deeper reality they represented. And beneath the marks, I began to feel the wall itself changing, softening, becoming permeable, transforming from barrier into membrane, into the thin skin that separated me from whatever waited on the other side. My co-workers no longer spoke to me at all. They had progressed beyond avoidance into complete ostracism, treated me as invisible, as already dead, as something that existed in the space between living and gone, as a ghost that haunted the manufactorum, but was no longer part of the social structure that defined humanity. When I entered common areas, they left. When I approached workstations, they found reasons to be elsewhere. When I tried to engage them directly, they looked through me with eyes that were terrified and apologetic and utterly unwilling to risk contamination by association. Only one person acknowledged me during those days. An old maintenance worker named Karis, a man so close to mandatory retirement that he had stopped caring about social consequences, who had seen enough horror in his 7 decades of service that one more damned soul barely registered as noteworthy. He cornered me in a tool storage room, his breath reeking of the cheap alcohol that lubricated so many lives in the underhive, his eyes roomy but focused, his voice a hoarse whisper that suggested both concern and resignation. "I've seen it before," he said, his hands shaking as he gripped my shoulder with strength that seemed impossible from his withered frame. "The marks, the watching, the way people avoid you like you're already corpse. It happened to a woman in my section, 15 years back. The marks spread until they covered everything she touched. Then one night, she just wasn't there anymore. Her bunk was empty. Her locker was sealed. The administrators said she had been transferred, but we knew something had taken her, had pulled her through the marks into wherever they lead. And the worst part? No one investigated. No one asked questions. She just disappeared from the records, became unperson, became another casualty that no one counted, because counting would mean acknowledging that something was wrong with the world, that the Imperium's protection was thinner than we pretended. What do? I asked, my voice breaking, my composure finally cracking under the weight of fear and isolation and the absolute certainty that no help was coming. Karis shook his head, his expression mixing pity and hopelessness. Nothing. There's nothing you can do. Once they mark you, once they start scratching through, you're claimed. You can run, but they'll follow. You can hide, but they'll find you. You can pray, but... He trailed off, made the sign of the Aquila, more from habit than faith. The Emperor protects the Imperium. Individual humans? We're just components, easily replaced. Our suffering doesn't register at the scales where his attention operates. You're alone with this, son. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He left me in the storage room, disappeared back into the manufactorum's depths. Left me with knowledge that was worse than ignorance, because now I knew that others had experienced this, that the pattern was established, that my fate was not unique, but was part of a cycle that the Imperium chose not to interrupt, because intervention would cost more than allowing occasional individuals to be consumed by whatever things scratched through from beyond the veil. I stood alone among the tools and spare parts, surrounded by the mundane debris of industrial labor, and I felt the boundary between worlds thinning, felt the marks that covered my hab unit's walls beginning to appear here too. Faint scratches on metal shelves and plasteel containers, growing deeper as I watched, spreading like infection, claiming new territory, expanding the zone where the hunters could reach through and touch material reality. The air grew cold despite the manufactorum's heat. My breath misted. The lights flickered, and in the moments of darkness between flickers, I saw shapes moving in the shadows, saw silhouettes that were not human, that possessed too many limbs, or too few, or configurations that shifted between forms, that seemed to be testing the barrier, probing for weakness, preparing for the moment when the scratches became large enough to permit passage, when the marks transformed from warning into doorway, when hunting became catching, and my role shifted from prey that fled to prey that was seized. I understood then that the boundary between worlds was thinning not randomly but deliberately, that every mark was a weakening, every scratch a crack in the fabric that separated here from elsewhere, that the hunters were not just pursuing me, but were actively preparing the path, were engineering my capture, were creating the conditions under which they could cross fully into my reality and claim what they had marked as theirs. I had perhaps days, perhaps hours, perhaps no time at all, because time was becoming unreliable, was stuttering and skipping, was being manipulated by forces that existed outside temporal sequence, that could compress moments or stretch them, that experienced causality differently than material consciousness. The marks covered my walls. Soon they would cover me. And when they did, when the scratches reached across the final barrier and carved themselves into my flesh rather than just the surfaces around me, the boundary would collapse completely and I would be pulled through, would be taken into the realm beyond the veil where the hunters waited with patience that was eternal and hunger that was absolute. I left the storage room. I returned to my hab unit. I sat on my bunk and watched the marks writhe and multiply and grow deeper, and I tried to prepare myself for whatever came next, tried to find some scrap of courage or faith or acceptance that would allow me to face my fate with dignity. But there was no dignity in being prey. There was only fear and waiting and the terrible knowledge that the scratches behind the veil were growing into doorways, and soon those doorways would open, and something would step through, and everything I was would end in ways I could not imagine and could not prevent. The marks pulsed with heat, the shadows deepened, and somewhere beyond the thin membrane of reality, I heard laughter that was not sound, felt a tension that was not sight, knew with absolute certainty that the hunters were pleased with my fear, were feeding on my despair, were growing stronger through my suffering. And the worst part, the part that broke me more than any physical threat, was knowing that no one would help, no one would investigate, no one would care when I disappeared, because my disappearance would be processed as routine casualty, as acceptable loss, as the price of operating in a universe where darkness was real and protection was reserved for those whose survival served strategic purpose. I was alone with the marks, alone with the hunters, alone with the knowledge that the veil was thinning, that the scratches were multiplying, that the boundary was collapsing. And when it collapsed completely, I would be taken. Not killed, not destroyed, but taken into whatever realm existed behind the veil, taken into the spaces where the hunters lived, taken to experience whatever fate they had prepared for prey that had been marked and claimed and finally, inevitably caught. The scratches grew deeper, reality grew thinner, and I waited because there was nothing else to do, nothing else left except waiting for the moment when the marks would become doorways and the doorways would open and the hunters would finally reach through and seize what they had claimed as theirs. I saw them next in the rusted grates of the underhive, glimmers of impossible eyes that should not exist in spaces too small to contain any biological structure capable of vision. I had fled my hab unit after the 7th night of watching the marks multiply, after waking to find them carved into my own skin, faint scratches on my forearms that burned with the same lingering heat as the marks on my walls, that proved the boundary was collapsing not just around me but through me, that my body was becoming permeable, was being prepared for passage into wherever the hunters waited. I descended into the underhive seeking refuge in anonymity, in the vast populations of the lower levels where millions existed beneath administrative notice, where the Imperium's records grew thin and surveillance systems failed from age and neglect, where one more desperate human might disappear into the crowds and become invisible through sheer statistical improbability. The underhive was darkness-made geography, was vertical kilometers of collapsed infrastructure and jury-rigged habitation, was the accumulated failure of centuries of construction, where each generation built upward and left the lower levels to rot, to be reclaimed by those too poor or too criminal or too broken to maintain residence in the maintained sectors. The air was thicker here, heavier with industrial pollutants and the accumulated exhalations of too many humans breathing the same recycled atmosphere for too long. The lighting was sporadic occasional lumen strips that flickered with unreliable power, supplemented by chemical torches and bioluminescent fungi that grew in the dampest corners, their pale glow barely sufficient for navigation, but better than the absolute darkness that claimed the deepest levels where even desperate humans feared to venture. The sounds were different too, were the symphony of human desperation rather than industrial routine voices shouting in dialects I barely understood, children crying, vendors hawking salvaged goods, the occasional discharge of stubbers or autoguns as gangs enforced their territorial claims through violence that the Arbeits never investigated because the underhive was written off as loss, as acceptable chaos, as the pressure valve where the hive's failures accumulated without threatening the productive sectors above. I moved through the crowds with my head down, my hands hidden in my work jacket's pockets to conceal the marks that had begun appearing on my skin, my pace neither too fast nor too slow, because both extremes attracted attention, and attention was what I could not afford. The crowds parted around me as they had in the Manufactorum, that same unconscious recoiling, that same animal recognition of something wrong, but here the response was different, was not ostracism, but predatory interest, was not avoidance but the focused attention of those who recognized weakness, who understood that someone fleeing was someone carrying something valuable or was themselves valuable as commodity, as target, as prey for hunters of a more mundane and comprehensible variety. I felt the human predator's attention, felt their calculation, felt them assessing whether I was worth the risk of confrontation or whether I might be diseased or mad or otherwise contaminated in ways that made me more trouble than profit. But I felt other attention too, attention that was not human, that observed from places humans did not look, that watched through apertures too small for eyes and from angles that geometry should not permit. The grates. The ventilation grates and drainage grills and access panels that honeycombed the underhive's architecture, that provided pathways for air and water and vermin, that were ubiquitous and ignored, part of the background infrastructure that no one consciously noticed, because noticing everything in the underhive would drive you mad, would paralyze you with the overwhelming sensory input of human misery and mechanical decay. I saw them first in a drainage grill set into the corridor floor, saw them as I stepped over the rusted metal lattice, saw the glimmer of reflection that was too purposeful to be mere light catching on water or metal, that moved when I moved, that tracked my passage with attention that was unmistakable. Eyes. Not human eyes. Not animal eyes. Eyes that existed in spaces too confined for any biological structure. Eyes that glowed faintly with light that had no source. Eyes that were singular and plural simultaneously. One eye that was somehow many eyes. Many eyes that were somehow one consciousness distributed across multiple apertures. Watching from beneath the floor. Watching from within the walls. Watching from the shadows where no physical form should fit, but where something had learned to compress itself, to fold its presence into dimensions that baseline matter could not occupy. I stopped walking. The crowds flowed around me, cursing and shoving, but I stood frozen above the grate, staring down into the eyes that stared up, and I felt recognition pass between us, not the recognition of familiarity, but the recognition of hunter acknowledging prey, of predator confirming its quarry, of something from beyond the veil, communicating across the thinning boundary that, yes, it saw me, yes, it knew me, yes, it was coming. I ran, broke from my frozen stance and plunged into the crowd, shoving past bodies that shouted curses and threats, ignoring the hands that grabbed at my jacket, ignoring the shouts of gang members whose territory I was crossing without proper deference or payment. I ran through corridors that twisted and branched unpredictably, through markets where stolen goods and forbidden substances were traded openly, through residential warrens where families lived stacked in spaces barely large enough for standing, through the accumulated geography of human desperation that was the Underhive's true architecture. The eyes followed. I saw them in every grate, every grill, every aperture. Saw them watching from ventilation shafts high in the walls, from drainage channels at corridor intersections, from access panels that should have been welded shut but gaped open with rust-eaten edges. The eyes were everywhere, were multiplying, were appearing in greater density the further I ran, as if my flight was drawing them, as if my fear was beacon that called more hunters, that amplified the attention focused on me until it felt like the entire Underhive was watching, was infested with the gaze of things that should not be. I tried to reach the Shrine District, the section of the Underhive where the ecclesiarchy maintained a presence, where priests and deacons ministered to the desperate masses, where faith was offered as opiate against despair, and the Emperor's protection was promised in exchange for devotion and submission. If anywhere in the Underhive might offer sanctuary, it would be there, in spaces consecrated to the God Emperor, in architecture decorated with holy symbols and purity seals, in environments where prayers were constant and faith was thick enough to perhaps, possibly, maybe create barrier against the things that hunted me. The shrine was a converted industrial space, its original function long forgotten, its current purpose declared by the massive aquila carved into the entrance a crude thing, obviously the work of local artisans rather than trained sculptors, but earnest in its devotion, sincere in its representation of the two-headed eagle that symbolized the Imperium's dual nature, its watchfulness over both material and spiritual domains. The interior was vast and dim, lit by thousands of candles whose light created more shadows than illumination, whose smoke accumulated in the high ceiling until the air was thick with incense and burning wax and the accumulated prayers of decades. Hundreds of people knelt in the pews, improvised benches cobbled together from salvaged materials, their surfaces worn smooth by the bodies of countless supplicants. They prayed with the desperation of the truly powerless, with the fervor of those who had nothing left except faith, who could not control their circumstances but could at least control their response to those circumstances, could offer their suffering to the Emperor and hope that somehow, somewhere, their pain mattered, was noticed, was redeemed by serving some purpose in the grand strategy of the Imperium's survival. I collapsed into a pew near the back, my breath ragged, my heart hammering, my hands shaking as I tried to still them, tried to appear as just another desperate soul seeking comfort, tried to blend into the mass of humanity that filled the shrine. Around me, people prayed aloud, some in high Gothic that they clearly did not understand but recited phonetically from memorized passages, some in low Gothic dialects so thick I could barely comprehend them, some in languages I did not recognize at all, but which carried the unmistakable cadence of supplication, of begging, of asking powers beyond human comprehension for intervention in circumstances that human agency could not alter. I tried to pray, whispered the words I remembered from childhood catechism, from mandatory observances, from the routine recitations that punctuated imperial life, "The Emperor protects." In his name we find strength, through his will we endure. But the words felt hollow, felt like speaking to void, felt like shouting into darkness that swallowed sound without echo or response. My faith, which had been background assumption rather than active conviction, proved insufficient when tested, proved to be performance rather than protection, proved to be cultural habit rather than spiritual armor. And still the eyes watched. I felt their gaze even here, even in this consecrated space, even surrounded by hundreds of faithful whose combined devotion should have created barrier against corruption and invasion. I looked up toward the shrine's ceiling and saw them in the shadows above the candles, saw them peering from the ventilation shafts that riddled the walls, saw them multiplying in the darkness that the candlelight could not reach, saw them moving closer, descending, approaching with the patience of hunters who knew their prey had run as far as it could run, had reached the last refuge, had nowhere left to flee. I approached the shrine's attendant, a deacon whose robes were patched and stained, but who wore his authority with the dignity of someone who believed absolutely in his purpose. He was conducting confessions at a small booth near the altar, listening to the sins and fears of supplicants who knelt before him and whispered their transgressions, who sought absolution through ritual that promised the emperor's forgiveness for those who acknowledged their failings and recommitted to faithful service. I waited in line, surrounded by others whose faces showed the accumulated suffering of underhive existence, malnutrition, industrial injuries, the physical marks of lives spent in labor that consumed bodies faster than they could be replaced. When my turn came, when I knelt before the deacon and began to speak, to describe the marks and the watching and the eyes that followed me everywhere, I saw his expression change from pastoral concern to bureaucratic dismissal, saw him shut down not from lack of compassion but from the overwhelming impossibility of addressing claims that fell outside his theological training, that suggested threats his faith was not equipped to confront. "You are experiencing spiritual distress," he said, his voice gentle but final, his tone suggesting diagnosis rather than engagement. "The underhive is difficult. The darkness here is both literal and metaphorical. Sometimes our minds create threats to externalize the suffering we cannot process internally. Sometimes," he paused, seemed to choose his next words carefully, "sometimes we perceive persecution because persecution gives meaning to pain that would otherwise be random and senseless. The emperor watches over all his servants, but his protection manifests through order, through hierarchy, through the proper functioning of imperial institutions. If you believe yourself in spiritual danger, you must report to the administratum for proper documentation and assessment. Faith alone cannot substitute for bureaucratic process." I tried to explain, tried to describe the marks on my walls, the heat that lingered in the claw grooves, the eyes that watched from every aperture. But he raised his hand, cutting off my words, his expression mixing sympathy and impatience in the manner of someone who heard desperate claims constantly, who could not address every plea for help without being paralyzed by the sheer volume of human suffering that filled the underhive like standing water. "I will pray for you," he said, which I understood meant he would not pray for me, would not remember me, would process me as another disturbed supplicant whose problems were psychological rather than spiritual, whose salvation required medication or institutionalization rather than theological intervention. The emperor protects those who maintain their faith and perform their duties. Trust in his plan. Trust in the Imperium's systems. Trust that your suffering serves purpose, even when that purpose is not visible to you. He made the sign of the aquila and gestured for the next supplicant to approach, dismissed me with the casual certainty of someone who had done his duty by offering prayers and platitudes, whose role was to process the spiritual distress of the masses in volume, rather than to actually address individual crises in depth. I stood, my knees aching from kneeling on the hard floor, and I understood that even here, even in the emperor's house, even surrounded by symbols of faith and protection, I would find no sanctuary, would receive no help, would be dismissed as delusional, because my experience did not fit into categories that the Imperium's theological framework acknowledged or its bureaucratic systems could process. I returned to the pews, sat among the praying masses, and I felt the eyes watching from above, felt their gaze intensifying, felt the hunters drawing closer with the confidence of predators who knew their prey had exhausted all options, had tried every refuge, had discovered that no sanctuary existed for those who had been marked and claimed and abandoned by the very systems that promised protection in exchange for faith and service. A child sat in the pew ahead of me, could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old, his face bearing the premature aging that characterized underhive children who grew up breathing polluted air and eating insufficient rations. He turned to look at me, his eyes meeting mine, and in his gaze I saw not the innocent curiosity of childhood but something else, something that used the child's face as mask, something that looked through his eyes with attention that was too focused, too knowing, too ancient to belong to any human consciousness. The child smiled, and the smile was wrong, was too wide, revealed too many teeth, created angles in his face that human musculature should not produce. He raised his hand and pointed upward, directing my attention to the shrine ceiling where the shadows moved with purpose, where shapes that were not quite visible coalesced and dispersed and coalesced again, where the eyes had multiplied into hundreds, into thousands, into density that suggested the ceiling was no longer solid structure, but was membrane, was skin stretched thin over a space that contained things that pressed against it from the other side, that tested its strength, that prepared to breach through when the barrier finally failed. "They see you," the child said, his voice carrying harmonics that did not come from human vocal cords, that suggested multiple speakers using a single mouth. "They have always seen you. They will always see you. You cannot hide in crowds. You cannot hide in consecrated spaces. You cannot hide anywhere because seeing is not about location or barriers or the thin walls between worlds. You are marked in dimensions that transcend physical space, marked in ways that make you visible across all possible hiding places, marked so thoroughly that even if you cease to exist, the mark would remain, and they would find it and remake you from the pattern your existence left behind." The people around me did not react to the child's words, did not seem to hear them, continued their prayers with the same desperate intensity they had maintained throughout my presence. I realized that the child's voice was meant only for me, was communication across the thinning boundary, was the hunters announcing their approach, was the final confirmation that all refuge was illusion, that all sanctuary was temporary, that I was being herded toward a conclusion that had always been inevitable from the moment the first mark appeared on my wall. I fled the shrine, ran back into the corridors of the underhive, back into the crowds that parted around me, back into the darkness that offered no concealment but at least did not pretend to be safety, did not offer false hope, did not compound my terror with the betrayal of discovering that even the Emperor's house was no protection against things that existed beyond his attention or his capacity to intervene. The eyes followed. They were in every shadow, every aperture, every reflective surface. They watched from puddles of chemical runoff, from the screens of abandoned data slates, from the polished metal of vendor stalls, from the eyes of other humans who had been infiltrated, who had been used as viewing portals, who carried the hunter's gaze without knowing they were no longer seeing with only their own vision. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled and my vision blurred with exhaustion. I ran until I could not run anymore, until I collapsed against a wall in a corridor whose location I could not identify, whose architecture I did not recognize, that might have been part of the underhive's documented sectors, or might have been one of those lost spaces that existed in the gaps of maps, that had fallen out of administrative awareness and been colonized by those who did not officially exist. And in that corridor, pressed against a wall that was slick with condensation and organic growth, surrounded by darkness that the underhive's inadequate lighting could not penetrate, I felt them arrive. Not physically, they had not crossed fully yet, had not breached the final barrier that separated their realm from mine. But they were close now, were pressing against that barrier with intention that was palpable, with presence that made the air thick and hard to breathe, with attention so focused and intense that it felt like weight, like gravity, like the irresistible pull of something massive exerting force across dimensional boundaries. The eyes opened, all of them simultaneously. Thousands of eyes in the darkness around me, in the walls and floor and ceiling, in dimensions I could not properly perceive but which my consciousness registered as wrongness, as spatial relationships that violated geometry, as presences occupying spaces that were simultaneously empty and full, absent and terribly, impossibly present. And they looked at me with recognition that was absolute, with hunger that was patient, with intention that was clear. I was theirs. I had always been theirs, and soon the watching would end, and the taking would begin. and whatever remained of me after the taking would wish for death, but would discover that death was mercy, and mercy was not a concept these hunters understood or cared to learn. The eyes blinked in unison, the darkness pressed closer, and I understood that my time was ending, that the hunt was entering its final phase, that all my running and hiding and desperate seeking of sanctuary had accomplished nothing except to prolong the inevitable, to extend the terror, to provide the hunters with the entertainment of watching prey exhaust every option before accepting that no options remained. I had nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide, no one left to ask for help. I was alone in the darkness with 10,000 eyes that had been watching, that were still watching, that would always be watching. And soon, very soon, they would open not just to watch but to reach through, to seize, to claim what they had marked as theirs from the beginning. The barrier broke the night the lights died across the hab block. Not my original hab block in the manufactorum levels, but the nameless warren in the underhive where I had finally collapsed. Too exhausted to run further, too broken to seek refuge I knew would not exist. I had found a corner in an abandoned residential section, a space that had been condemned decades ago after structural failure made it too dangerous for habitation, its residents relocated and its access officially sealed, though the seals had long since been broken by scavengers and squatters who needed shelter more than they feared building collapse. The darkness here was different from the darkness of functional spaces, was absolute in ways that suggested the power grid had not merely failed but had been severed, had been deliberately cut to create conditions where light could not penetrate, where the boundary between visible and invisible dissolved, where things that required darkness to manifest could finally cross the threshold from elsewhere to here. I had a chemical torch, one of the cheap ones sold in underhive markets, its fuel cell depleted to maybe 10%, its light casting a sphere of sickly green illumination that extended perhaps 2 meters before being swallowed by the oppressive dark that pressed against it like physical substance, like the darkness had weight and intention and was actively working to extinguish the last fragile barrier between me and complete blindness. I sat with my back against a wall whose surface was slick with moisture and organic growth, my knees drawn up to my chest, my arms wrapped around my legs in the fetal position of someone who has abandoned all pretense of dignity, who has accepted that survival is no longer possible and that the only remaining question is how much suffering will precede the end. The marks covered my skin now, had spread from my forearms to my chest and back, had begun appearing on my legs and neck, fine scratches that burned with that same lingering heat, that proved my body was being prepared, was being transformed into something permeable, into interface rather than barrier, into gateway through which the hunters could reach from their realm into mine. The air in the abandoned hab block tasted wrong. Not the usual underhive taste of chemical pollutants and human waste and industrial runoff, but something else, something that suggested foreign chemistry, impossible compounds, substances that should not exist in atmosphere governed by standard physics and carbon-based biology. I breathed it because breathing was involuntary, was autonomic function, but each inhalation made my lungs burn and my throat constrict and my head swim with sensations that were not quite dizziness, not quite nausea, but something between and worse than both. Something that suggested my body was rejecting air that was no longer entirely air, that had been infiltrated by something from elsewhere, by the exhalation of things that breathed atmospheres humans were never meant to process. The lights died at what my chronometer insisted was 2:34, though time had become so unreliable that the numbers were merely comforting fiction, were my mind's desperate attempt to impose structure on experience that had transcended temporal sequence. One moment, the emergency lighting that lined the corridors, dim and flickering but present, was providing minimal visibility. The next moment, absolute darkness. Not the gradual dimming of failing power, but instantaneous cessation, as if every photon had been simultaneously extinguished, as if light itself had been forbidden from existing in this space, as if the laws that governed electromagnetic radiation had been temporarily suspended to create conditions necessary for what came next. My chemical torch remained lit, its green glow suddenly the only light source in what felt like kilometers of absolute dark. I held it up, swept it across the corridor, saw shadows that moved wrong, that did not respond to the torch's movement the way physics dictated shadows should respond, that possessed independence, that pulled away from the light rather than being dispelled by it, that retreated not because illumination eliminated them, but because they chose to withdraw, temporarily, tactically, in the manner of intelligent agents, rather than mere absence of photons. I heard it before I saw it. The sound of tearing not fabric but something more fundamental, as if reality itself was being ripped, as if the membrane that separated here from elsewhere was being clawed open from the other side. It started as whisper, as subtle distortion in the ambient noise, but grew rapidly in volume and intensity until it filled the corridor, until the sound was physical force, until I felt it in my chest as vibration, felt it in my teeth as resonance, felt it in my bones as the fundamental wrongness of matter being forced to behave in ways matter was never designed to accommodate. The sound was accompanied by another screaming metal, as if massive sheets of industrial alloy were being bent and twisted by forces that exceeded their structural tolerances, that warped and compressed and folded them into configurations that violated their molecular bonds. But there was no metal here, no visible source for the sound, only the walls and floor and ceiling of the abandoned hab block, whose surfaces remained intact, whose structure showed no physical distortion, even as the sound of their violation filled the air with intensity that made my ears ring and my vision blur. And then I saw it manifest. Not appear. Manifestation was different from appearance, was not the simple revelation of something that had been hidden, but was the gradual materialization of something that had not existed in this dimension until that moment, that was being pulled through or pushed through, or was forcing itself through the boundary between realms, that was arriving through process that violated every assumption about how matter and space and presence functioned. It crawled into reality through the wall itself, not breaking through but emerging from within, as if the wall was not solid barrier but was membrane, was skin, was surface tension stretched over depth that should not exist behind mere structural panels. The thing's form was wrong, was geometrically impossible, was configuration of limbs and angles and surfaces that human vision could not properly process, because human neurology had evolved to perceive three-dimensional space, and this thing occupied more dimensions than three, existed in orientations that my brain tried to interpret but failed, created optical illusions that were not illusions but were accurate representations of geometry that transcended Euclidean frameworks. The limbs, if they were limbs, if that word had any meaning for appendages that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, scraped along the corridor floor, and the sound was exactly the sound I had heard in the Manufactorum tunnels months ago, was the scratching that had announced the hunt's beginning, was the signature of claws that were not physical matter, but were extensions of will, of intention, of hunger given temporary form through the act of crossing from realm where consciousness was primary to realm where matter was primary. Its form shifted like molten shadow, like liquid darkness given temporary solidity, like something that had no fixed configuration but assumed shapes based on observers' fear, on prey's expectations, on the particular nightmares that each consciousness carried. When I looked directly at it, it resolved into approximately arachnid configuration: too many legs, too many joints, body segments that connected in ways that suggested insect but scaled to sizes insects could never achieve. When I looked away and perceived it through peripheral vision, it became something else, became mass of reaching tendrils, became cloud of particulate darkness, became abstract geometry of malevolent purpose that had no biological analog at all. The only constant was the eyes. They were distributed across its form without pattern, without bilateral symmetry, appearing and disappearing as its shape flowed, but always watching, always focused on me with attention that was absolute and terrifying. They were the same eyes I had seen in the grates, in the shadows, in the reflections, but now they were anchored in something physical or near physical, or as physical as something from beyond the veil could become when it forced itself into material reality. I tried to move, tried to stand, to run, to do anything except sit frozen while the thing completed its manifestation. But my body would not respond, was paralyzed not by fear alone but by something else, by presence that exerted force on consciousness itself, that pressed against my will and found it insufficient, that overrode autonomic functions and voluntary commands alike, that made my flesh into prison, into trap, into cage that prevented flight even though flight was pointless, was futile, was merely prolonging the inevitable. The taste of copper filled my mouth, metallic and sharp, and accompanied by sensation of pressure that had no physical source, that suggested my blood itself was responding to the thing's presence, was being affected by proximity to something whose existence violated the chemistry that sustained human life. I felt my teeth ache, felt my gums begin to bleed, tasted the iron tang of my own blood mixing with the copper taste that came from elsewhere, from the air itself, from the warp pressure that was building in the corridor, as the boundary between dimensions thinned to translucency, to gossamer, to nothing. The air crackled. Not with electricity, but with something else. With energy that was not electromagnetic, but was psychic, was the friction of consciousness against consciousness, was the sensation of my awareness being abraded by contact with awareness that operated under completely different principles, that thoughts human neurology was not designed to process, that wanted things human ethics had no framework to comprehend. The creature spoke, or rather, it communicated, broadcast intention and meaning without requiring the medium of language or sound. The words, if they were words, if that term applied to concepts that were impressed directly onto consciousness without linguistic encoding, appeared in my mind fully formed, complete, as if they had always been there but had only now become conscious, had been lying dormant in my thoughts waiting for the moment when the speaker would activate them. You ran well, it said, impressed, communicated. You provided entertainment. You flavored your fear with hope and desperation and betrayal and abandonment, with all the rich emotions that make human suffering so exquisite, so much more complex than the simple terror of lesser prey. We have tasted your fear for months now, have fed on each spike of adrenaline, each moment of despair, each time you believed you had found sanctuary, only to discover that sanctuary was illusion. You have nourished us through your suffering. Now comes the final course. Now comes the moment when we consume not just your fear but yourself, when we take not just your emotions but your essence, when we demonstrate that the boundary between you and us was always thinner than you believed, that the self you defended so desperately is not protected by flesh or skull, but is naked to our attention, is accessible to our hunger, is ready for harvesting. I tried to pray, tried to form the words of the imperial creed, tried to invoke the emperor's protection, tried to grasp at the faith that should have sustained me, that the Imperium promised would shield the faithful from corruption and damnation. But the words would not come, would not form, were blocked at the source, as if the creature's presence prevented prayer, prevented faith, prevented any appeal to powers that might have contested its claim, that might have offered protection or mercy, or even the dignity of dying with belief intact. The creature moved closer, its limbs scraping across the floor with sounds that should not have been so loud, that echoed with amplification that suggested the acoustic properties of the space had been altered, had been transformed into chamber designed to magnify horror, to ensure that every sound registered with maximum psychological impact, that nothing about the experience would be muted or softened or made bearable. I felt its presence not just visually or audibly but in every sense simultaneously, overwhelming sensory integration, flooding consciousness with input that exceeded processing capacity. It smelled like ozone and burning hair and something sweet that made my stomach turn, that suggested decay and seduction were not opposites, but were aspects of the same fundamental corruption. It radiated cold, bone-deep cold, that had nothing to do with temperature, that was absence of heat but also absence of something else, absence of the warmth that life generated, that suggested proximity to death or undeath, or states that transcended the binary of living and dead. Its touch, when it came when one of those impossible limbs extended toward me, when it made contact with my arm where the marks had been carved deepest, was nothing like physical contact, was not the sensation of solid matter meeting solid matter, but was something else entirely, was intrusion, was violation, was the feeling of being breached, not physically but metaphysically, was the sensation of something reaching through my flesh without breaking skin, reaching through my consciousness without requiring physical pathway, reaching into the deepest parts of my identity and beginning to pull, to extract, to harvest whatever it found there. The pain was extraordinary but distant, as if it was happening to someone else, as if I was observing my own suffering from outside my body, from perspective that was simultaneously intimate and detached. I felt myself fragmenting, felt my memories being accessed and examined and consumed, felt my identity being unraveled like thread being pulled from fabric, felt the continuous narrative of self, the story I told myself about who I was, what I valued, what defined Corvus Thane as distinct entity rather than merely collection of biological processes being dismantled piece by piece, memory by memory, until what remained was not person but was raw consciousness, awareness without identity, experience without experiencer. The creature's laughter filled the corridor, filled my mind, filled existence itself until nothing else existed except that sound. That terrible sound that was not amusement exactly but was satisfaction, was the pleasure of hunter consuming prey after long chase, was the culmination of months of stalking and terrorizing and preparing, was the final confirmation that the hunt had succeeded, that the prey had been cornered and caught and was now being processed, was being transformed from living being into food, into sustenance, into the particular delicacy that conscious suffering provided to entities that fed on consciousness itself. I screamed, or tried to scream, but the sound that emerged was not my voice, was not human vocalization, was something else, was the sound of reality being forced to accommodate presence it was never designed to contain, was the protest of material universe against intrusion from immaterial realm, was the wail of physics breaking down at the point where two incompatible states of existence met and failed to integrate and created friction that manifested as sound and heat and the sensation of everything solid becoming fluid, everything certain becoming negotiable, everything real becoming questionable. The chemical torch flickered, its light growing dimmer as if the creature's presence consumed not just matter and consciousness but light itself, as if photons were being absorbed or destroyed or transformed into something else, something dark, something that did not illuminate but obscured, that did not reveal but concealed, that was anti-light, was darkness made active rather than passive, was shadow given appetite and intention. In the failing light I saw more movement in the corridor, saw that the creature had not come alone, had not been the only thing to cross through when the barrier broke. Others were manifesting, were crawling from walls and ceiling and floor, were emerging from the darkness as if darkness was not absence, but was substance, was medium through which they traveled, was their native element, from which they could emerge into material reality when conditions permitted, when boundaries thinned sufficiently, when prey had been marked and claimed and was ready for harvest. They surrounded me, a dozen of them, perhaps more, their forms all different but all wrong, all impossible, all configurations of matter and antimatter and something else matter that human perception tried and failed to categorize. They moved with coordination that suggested pack behavior, suggested communication between them, suggested they were not individuals but were aspects of single consciousness distributed across multiple manifestations, were fingers of a hand that existed in dimensions I could not see, but which converged here, in this corridor, in this moment, for the purpose of claiming what they had marked months ago in a tunnel beneath the manufactorum, where I had been foolish enough to notice their presence, to acknowledge their existence, to create the connection that allowed them to mark me in return. The first creature tightened its grip, its metaphysical grip, its hold on my consciousness, and I felt myself being pulled, being drawn toward it or into it or through it, felt my awareness being separated from my body, felt the thin thread that connected consciousness to flesh being stretched and tested and prepared for severing. This was not death. Death would have been mercy. This was extraction, was harvesting, was the removal of consciousness from its biological housing while keeping both consciousness and biology intact, was the creation of state where I would remain aware but unhoused, would experience existence without the comfort of embodiment, would be naked consciousness, exposed to realms where consciousness without protection was prey, was food, was entertainment for things that existed eternally and required diversion to fill the endless now of their existence. I hid. Not physically, my body remained frozen against the wall, remained trapped in the creature's grip, but some core part of me, some fragment of self that proved more flexible or more desperate or more stubborn than the rest, retreated inward, compressed itself into the deepest corners of my consciousness, created layers between itself and the thing that was trying to extract it, built walls of memory and identity and will that were inadequate, were futile, were doomed to fail, but which bought seconds or minutes or moments of continued existence before the inevitable extraction. I pressed myself between broken pipes that lined the wall beside me, wedged my body into a gap barely wide enough to accommodate human form, used my physical confinement to create psychological barrier, to give my fragmenting consciousness something concrete to hold on to, something material that suggested boundaries and separation, and the possibility, however illusory, of hiding from attention that was absolute. The creature's hissing laughter intensified, grew louder, multiplied as the others joined in, as a chorus of things that should not exist created symphony of mockery, of amusement at prey that still believed it could hide, that still maintained hope even after every hope had been proven false, that demonstrated the particular comedy of consciousness that refused to accept its own consumption, even as consumption progressed inexorably toward completion. Through the failing light of my chemical torch, in the last moments before it guttered completely and left me in absolute darkness with the hunters that had crossed over, I saw my reflection in a puddle of chemical runoff on the floor, saw my face, but wrong, twisted, bearing marks that were no longer mere scratches but were deep grooves, were carvings that suggested my flesh was being rewritten, was being inscribed with script that came from elsewhere, was being transformed into text, into document, into record of my own consumption that would remain after consumption was complete, that would serve as warning or invitation, or merely as aesthetic declaration that this prey had been claimed, had been processed, had been found sufficient for harvesting by the things that hunted in the spaces behind the veil. The barrier had broken, the hunters had crossed, and I, marked and claimed and cornered, had nowhere left to run except inward, into the shrinking spaces of my own consciousness, into the last refuges that would soon be breached, soon be violated, soon be harvested like everything else. The chemical torch died, darkness absolute consumed the corridor, and in that darkness, I felt multiple presences pressing close, felt countless limbs reaching toward me, felt infinite eyes watching the final moments before extraction, before harvesting, before I would be pulled through the barrier into whatever realm they inhabited, whatever space existed behind the veil where prey was processed and consciousness was consumed, and suffering was entertainment that could last forever, because time was different, there was negotiable, was something that could be stretched and compressed and made eternal. I had crossed over, or rather, they had crossed to me. And now the taking would begin in earnest, and whatever came after would make the hunt seem merciful by comparison, would make the months of terror seem gentle, would demonstrate that fear was merely appetizer, and the main course was something far worse, far more terrible, far more absolute. The hissing laughter continued in the darkness, the limbs closed around me, and I felt myself begin to dissolve, to fragment, to be pulled apart, not physically but metaphysically, consciousness being separated from flesh, identity being extracted from body, self being harvested from the biological machinery that had housed it. This was the first breach. This was what happened when the barrier failed. This was the reality of being caught by things that existed beyond the veil and had learned to cross when conditions permitted. And it was only the beginning. I fled. I do not remember how I fled, do not remember the transition from paralyzed prey to running refugee, do not remember the moment when the creature's grip released, or why it released, or whether release was mercy or tactical choice, was respite, or was merely the hunters deciding that more entertainment could be extracted from chase than from immediate consumption. My body moved without conscious direction, moved through autonomic survival response, moved because stopping meant dying or worse than dying, meant being pulled back into that grip, meant experiencing again the sensation of being unmade, of consciousness being peeled from flesh like skin from fruit. I ran through corridors I did not recognize, through sections of the underhive that might have been mapped once but whose geography had been altered by collapse and reconstruction, and the slow organic growth of human habitation that followed no plan, that obeyed no rational design, that simply accumulated over decades and centuries until the space became maze, became labyrinth, became the physical manifestation of chaos pretending to be architecture. The darkness was not absolute anymore. Emergency lighting had flickered back on in some sections, though the lights were wrong, were the wrong color, were too red or too blue, or shades that had no name in human color theory, were illumination that came from elsewhere. that suggested the hive itself had been wounded, had been breached, had been infiltrated by the same forces that had crossed through to claim me. Alarms blared through the Vox system, not the usual warnings about structural failure or atmospheric contamination, but something else, something more urgent, more desperate, the kind of alarm that announced catastrophic emergency, that told the population to evacuate or shelter or prepare for the worst. The words were garbled, distorted by interference that suggested the communication systems themselves had been compromised, had been invaded by signals that came from elsewhere, that spoke in frequencies human vocal cords could not produce, and human ears should not be able to hear, but which my altered perception registered as words, as commands, as invitations to surrender, to submit, to accept what was coming, because resistance was futile and fighting only prolonged suffering that was inevitable. The corridors were filled with civilians, thousands of them, tens of thousands, the entire population of the hab blocks that surrounded the breach point, all moving at once, all fleeing from something they could not see but could feel, could sense through the animal hindbrain that still remembered when darkness held genuine threats, when running was appropriate response to danger that could not be fought, when survival meant abandoning everything except the imperative to move, to escape, to put distance between self and source of terror. They stampeded like animals, like cattle driven by fire, like organisms whose higher functions had been overridden by panic, who existed solely as vectors of fear, who crushed the weak and trampled the fallen and created cascading disasters as too many bodies tried to occupy too little space, as doorways became choke points, as stairwells became killing grounds where the press of bodies from behind forced those in front over edges, through railings, down shafts that should have been protected, but whose protections had failed or been deliberately removed by scavengers who needed the metal more than they feared the deaths their theft would cause. I joined the stampede because standing still meant being crushed, meant being trampled, meant being processed by the crowd's momentum into biological debris that would be swept aside or built over, or simply left to decompose in corners where the flow had deposited it. I moved with the crowd, let their panic carry me, used their mass as camouflage, as concealment, as temporary refuge from the things that hunted me, because surely, amid so many potential victims, the hunters would be distracted, would find easier prey, would focus their attention elsewhere, and give me opportunity to escape, to hide, to somehow survive what should not be survivable. But somehow the daemon moved faster. I felt it even before I saw it, felt its presence tracking me through the crowd, felt its attention remaining fixed on me despite the thousands of other humans available for harvest, felt it demonstrating that I had been specifically marked, had been chosen, had been claimed in ways that transcended physical proximity, that operated through connections that existed in dimensions the crowd could not perceive and could not disrupt. It moved through the stampeding mass without resistance, without collision, as if it occupied space that the crowd's bodies did not occupy, as if it existed in phase that was slightly offset from material reality, that allowed it to pass through rather than around obstacles, that made walls and bodies and all physical barriers irrelevant to its pursuit. I caught glimpses of it as I ran, saw it moving through walls, saw its form appearing in reflections that should not contain it, saw it manifesting in the shadows that the emergency lighting cast, saw it everywhere and nowhere, saw it approaching with the terrible patience of predator that knew its prey was contained, was trapped within the hive's geography, had no escape route except through levels and districts that the daemon could access more easily than I could, that provided no sanctuary, because sanctuary required boundaries, and boundaries were meaningless to things that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The crowd's movement became more chaotic as we fled deeper into the hive, as the organized corridors of the residential levels gave way to the improvised passages of the deep underhive, as architecture became suggestion rather than structure, as floors softened and walls bent, and the very geometry of space began to respond to presence that should not exist in material reality, but which was imposing itself anyway, was rewriting local physics, was transforming environment to suit its nature rather than adapting to environment's constraints. I felt it in my feet. First, the floor was not solid anymore, was not the reliable ferrocrete and metal that should have provided stable platform for running. It had become soft, spongy, yielding under each step in ways that suggested organic tissue rather than industrial material, that suggested the floor was not construction but was flesh, was skin, was membrane stretched over something living that pulsed and breathed beneath our feet. Others felt it too. I saw them stumble, saw them look down in horror at the surface they walked on. Saw them recognize that the hive itself was being transformed, was being invaded not just by entities from elsewhere, but by the very substance of elsewhere, by the reality of the realm, beyond the veil, bleeding through into material universe, and beginning to overwrite, to replace, to colonize. The air thickened. Each breath required effort, required forcing lungs to expand against resistance that was not atmospheric pressure, but was something else. Was the weight of wrong reality pressing down? Was the sensation of trying to breathe medium that was not quite air anymore, that had been infiltrated by gases or pseudo-gases or psychic emanations that looked like gas but were actually solidified thought, were emotion made physical, were fear and despair and madness given chemical structure that invaded lungs and bloodstream and brain. Every room I entered warped as I crossed its threshold. Doorways that should have led to familiar spaces, storage chambers, habitation units, transit corridors, instead opened onto geometries that violated Euclidean principles, that contained more space than their dimensions should permit, that extended into distances that could not exist within the hive's known volume. I watched a family flee through a doorway that should have led to a stairwell and instead led to a shaft that descended infinitely, that contained no stairs but only falling, only the eternal descent into darkness that swallowed their screams before their bodies finished accelerating, that demonstrated that the hive's geography was no longer fixed, was no longer trustworthy, was becoming maze designed by malevolent intelligence specifically to trap and confuse and prevent escape. Whispers seeped from machinery, from the Vox grills and ventilation systems and the data ports that dotted every corridor. Not human whispers, these were layered, multiple, overlapping until they became static, that suggested meaning without providing clarity, that created the impression of communication without allowing comprehension, that made consciousness strain to pass signal from noise, and in that straining became vulnerable, became open, became receptive to suggestion that was being broadcast by the whispers themselves, by the things that had learned to use the hive's communication systems as vectors for invasion, for corruption, for the slow transformation of material consciousness into something more compatible with immaterial existence. I tried to maintain direction, tried to navigate toward the upper levels where the Arbites maintained their fortresses, where the imperial authority was strongest, where surely someone would respond to the breach, would deploy forces to contain it, would establish perimeter and begin the process of purging the corruption that had infiltrated the hive's lower levels. But direction was meaningless when geometry changed with each turn, when corridors looped back on themselves, when what appeared to be ascent revealed itself to be descent, when the hive had become non-Euclidean architecture that followed rules known only to the things that were rewriting it. Authority figures appeared, Arbites enforcers in their carapace armor, their helmets sealed, their shotguns raised, their voices distorted through helmet Vox units as they shouted orders that the panicking crowd ignored because orders meant nothing when reality itself was unraveling, when the ground beneath your feet was no longer solid and the air you breathed was no longer safe and the walls around you were bleeding substances that should not exist. The Arbites tried to establish order, tried to funnel the crowd toward designated evacuation routes, tried to maintain the fiction that this was manageable emergency, was crisis that could be contained through proper protocols and disciplined response. But even they recoiled when I passed, even they stepped back. Even they recognized something in me or on me or following me that made me more dangerous than the general chaos, that marked me as vector, as carrier, as someone who had been too close to the breach and had brought contamination with me, had become infectious, had transformed from refugee requiring protection into threat requiring elimination. I saw it in their posture, in the way their weapons tracked my movement, in the way their helmet optics focused on me with intensity that suggested targeting rather than assessment, that suggested they were calculating whether my elimination would be justified, whether individual execution would prevent greater contamination, whether murdering one infected civilian was acceptable price for potentially containing outbreak. I ran from them as I ran from everything else, ran before they could make their decision, ran before their training overrode their hesitation, ran because stopping for authority meant explaining, and explaining required time, and time was what I did not have, what I could never have again, what had become enemy as much as any physical threat, because every second of delay was second closer to being caught, to being claimed, to experiencing again that terrible extraction, that harvesting of consciousness that had been interrupted but not prevented, that was still coming, was still inevitable, was merely postponed until the hunters closed distance again. The stench of the warp followed me, preceded me, surrounded me with intensity that made civilians vomit and retch, and empty their bowels in involuntary response to olfactory assault that transcended mere smell, that was psychic attack disguised as sensory input, that suggested my presence alone was poisoning the air, was making environment uninhabitable, was spreading corruption through proximity alone. I had become plague, had become vector for invasion, had become the thing that refugees fled from rather than refugee fleeing with them, had crossed threshold from victim to threat without choosing, without consenting, without any agency except the recognition that whatever I had become, I could no longer pretend to be merely human suffering, merely human misfortune. My presence alone endangered the hive. I understood this with crystalline clarity born from watching the geometry warp more dramatically where I walked, from seeing the corruption intensify in my wake, from recognizing that the breach had been anchored to me, had used me as marker, as beacon, as the point through which elsewhere could enter here, as the crack through which the warp could bleed into material reality. The hunters had not just marked me for pursuit, they had marked me for purpose, had transformed me into tool, into weapon, into the means by which they could expand their invasion beyond single individual, beyond isolated incident, beyond containment. I tried to isolate myself, tried to flee away from populated areas, tried to lead the contamination away from those who might still be saved, who might still escape if I removed myself as focal point, as anchor, as the living breach through which the warp continued to pour. But isolation was impossible in the hive where every space was occupied, where every corridor connected to other corridors, where refugees fled in all directions without coordination, without plan, without any objective except away from the horror that was spreading through the lower levels like infection, like fire, like the visible manifestation of hell, deciding it no longer needed to stay beneath the surface, but could rise openly, could claim territory, could demonstrate that the boundary between material and immaterial was always thinner than the Imperium admitted, was always vulnerable to breach when conditions permitted, when someone was foolish enough or unlucky enough to attract attention from the things that waited beyond the veil. I collapsed finally in a transit station whose elevators had ceased functioning, whose platforms were crowded with refugees who had hoped to escape upward, but who now found themselves trapped, found themselves confined in space that should have been temporary waypoint, but had become prison, had become killing ground, where the crowd compressed itself through the mindless pressure of more arrivals from below meeting immovable barrier of inoperative transportation above. I sat against a wall, my breath ragged, my body trembling with exhaustion that transcended physical fatigue, that suggested my very existence was becoming unsustainable, was consuming resources faster than they could be replenished, was burning through the biochemical reserves that maintained consciousness and coordination and the basic functions that distinguished living organism from organic debris. Around me, the crowd pressed and surged and screamed, and I realized with horror that was almost acceptance that I had brought them here, had led them to this place, had attracted them through the unconscious magnetism of extreme fear, through the way terror creates gravity that pulls other conscious beings toward witness, toward participation, toward the terrible fascination of watching others suffer what you fear for yourself. The daemon was coming. I felt it approaching through walls and floor and dimensions I could not name, felt it drawing closer with the patience of hunter that knew its prey was cornered, was trapped in space with limited exits, was surrounded by witnesses whose presence would make the capture more entertaining, more theatrical, more satisfying to appetite that fed not just on fear but on the spreading of fear, on the contamination of others through forced witness of horrors they could not unsee, could not forget, could not rationalize as anything except proof that darkness was real and safety was illusion, and the Imperium's promises of protection were lies told to children to help them sleep. The crowd began to notice my presence, began to recognize me as source or catalyst or focus for whatever was coming, began to draw away, even though space was limited, and drawing away meant crushing themselves against walls and railings, and each other, in desperate attempt to create distance from the thing I had become. Their faces showed not just fear but recognition, showed that they knew instinctively what I had learned through experience, that I was marked, was claimed, was vector for corruption that would spread from me to them if they allowed contact. If they failed to isolate me, if they maintained any connection that might allow what hunted me to notice them, to mark them, to expand its hunting ground beyond single target into general harvest. And I understood then, understood with terrible clarity that cut through exhaustion and fear and the fog of altered consciousness, that I could not allow myself to be taken here, could not allow the hunters to claim me in this crowded space where thousands would witness, would be traumatized, would be corrupted by proximity to breach that would occur when the boundary finally collapsed completely and the hunters pulled me through, when the extraction that had been interrupted in the abandoned hab block was finally completed in public space, where the contamination could spread exponentially, where the warp could use my harvesting as ritual, as ceremony, as demonstration that would mark all these witnesses, would plant seeds in their consciousness that would grow into future breaches, future invasions, future casualties in the endless war between material reality and immaterial hunger. I stood, forced my trembling legs to support my weight, began pushing through the crowd toward the transit station's emergency exits, toward the maintenance tunnels and service shafts that were not meant for civilian use, but which might provide egress, might allow me to isolate before the hunters arrived, might give me opportunity to die alone rather than becoming spectacle, becoming infection vector, becoming the means by which the warp claimed thousands rather than one. The crowd resisted my movement, pressed against me, tried to prevent my passage not through conscious decision but through the animal impulse to maintain distance from threat, to create barrier between themselves and contamination, to sacrifice my mobility for their illusion of safety. But I pushed through anyway, used elbows and shoulders and the desperate strength of someone who had nothing left to lose except the burden of knowing his death would cause other deaths, who could not prevent his own consumption but could at least choose the circumstances, could at least deny the hunters the satisfaction of public harvest, of contaminating thousands through forced witness. I reached the maintenance access, forced the door open with strength I should not possess, slipped through into darkness that was deeper than the transit station's inadequate lighting, into spaces where no one would follow, where I could run my final distance, where I could find whatever corner remained in this wounded hive to die in, to be harvested in, to be pulled through the veil in private horror rather than public spectacle. The door sealed behind me, the crowd's noise became muffled, distant, and in the darkness of the maintenance tunnel, I felt the hunters' presence intensify, felt them closing distance with renewed purpose, felt them approving of my choice, of my decision to isolate, of my cooperation in making their harvest efficient, contained, properly theatrical, even if the theater was now empty of witnesses. I ran into darkness, ran toward nothing. Ran because running was all that remained, even when destination was irrelevant, even when escape was impossible, even when the only choice left was whether to meet the inevitable standing or fleeing, composed or broken, human, or something that had already been transformed by months of terror into something less, something that would not be mourned, that would not be missed, that would disappear into the wound the hive had sustained and leave no trace except marks on walls and memories in minds that would try desperately to forget what they had seen, what they had felt, what they had learned about the true nature of the universe when the veil was torn and something from beyond reached through and took what it had claimed. One daemon became many in the maintenance tunnels beneath the transit station, in the darkness that was absolute, except for the faint bioluminescence of fungal growths that lined the walls like diseased stars, in the silence that was broken only by my ragged breathing and the dripping of condensation, and the sounds that were not sounds but were impressions of movement, of presence, of things approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. I had thought isolation would limit the contamination, would contain the breach to myself alone, would spare the thousands above from direct exposure to whatever came next. But I had misunderstood the nature of what hunted me, had failed to comprehend that the demon in the abandoned hab block had not been singular entity but had been manifestation, had been tendril, had been the exploratory probe of something larger, something distributed, something that existed as multiplicity rather than individual, as hive consciousness rather than discrete being. They stalked me with terrible purpose now that I was alone, now that I had removed myself from witnesses and protection and the last illusions of safety that crowds provided. I felt them in the tunnels around me, felt them moving through walls and floor and ceiling, felt them approaching from ahead and behind and above and below, and from angles that should not exist, from dimensions that intersected with the tunnel's three-dimensional space in ways that created geometric impossibilities, that allowed them to occupy positions that were simultaneously near and far, present and approaching, here and elsewhere. Their shapes twisted into nightmares drawn from my memories, from my fears, from the accumulated psychological damage of months spent knowing I was hunted, knowing I was claimed, knowing that no escape existed, and that every moment of continued existence was merely prolonging the inevitable. I saw my mother's face emerge from the darkness, not her living face but her death face, the expression she had worn in final moments of the plague that had consumed her 15 years ago, the look of betrayed confusion that had haunted my dreams since childhood, that had taught me early that the Imperium's promises of protection were conditional, were reserved for those whose survival served utility, were revoked without mercy when utility ended. The mother thing spoke with voice that was simultaneously hers and not hers, was approximation created by entity that had accessed my memories and extracted her vocal patterns, her mannerisms, her particular inflections, and was now wearing them like costume, like mask, like the skin of human familiarity draped over alien intention. Why did you run, Corvus? Why did you leave me? I waited for you in the Medicae ward. I called your name. I needed you. But you were afraid of the plague, afraid of contamination, afraid to hold my hand while I died. You abandoned me then, and you're trying to abandon us now. But we won't let you. We've invested too much, have fed too long on your fear, have spent months preparing you for this moment. You belong to us. You always belong to us. From the moment you noticed us in the tunnel, from the moment you acknowledged our presence, you created connection that cannot be severed, that binds you to us across all possible realities, across all possible futures, across death itself, because death is just boundary, and boundaries are what we cross, what we dissolve, what we render meaningless. I ran from the mother thing, turned down a side passage, fled deeper into the maintenance system's labyrinth, but others waited there. Other manifestations drawn from my psychological archive. Other faces and forms that should not exist in these tunnels but did, that had been given temporary physicality through the hunter's ability to read consciousness, to extract memories, to weaponize nostalgia and guilt and regret against prey whose resistance had been eroded by months of psychological assault. I saw Foreman Grecht, or the thing wearing Grecht's form, his augmetic eye clicking and whirring as it tracked my movement, his voice carrying the same dismissive certainty it had carried when I reported the first signs, when I tried to warn him, when I sought help that he refused because my experience did not fit his categories, did not conform to problems he was trained to address. Fatigue-induced hallucination, the Grecht thing said, moving toward me with steps that left no footprints in the film of moisture that covered the tunnel floor, that suggested his mass was illusory, that he was projection rather than presence, was image broadcast into material reality rather than physical form. You're experiencing psychological breakdown due to prolonged stress exposure. The solution is increased productivity, double stimulant rations, psychological evaluation if symptoms persist. Stop wasting my time with ghost stories. Stop pretending your suffering is special. Everyone suffers. Everyone is afraid. But we continue working because work is what gives suffering meaning, what transforms pain into productivity, what allows the Imperium to function despite the universal misery of existence. You're not being hunted. You're just afraid of the dark. More figures appeared as I fled, co-workers who had avoided me, Arbites who had considered executing me, the deacon who had dismissed my pleas as spiritual distress, requiring bureaucratic process rather than immediate intervention. Each one spoke truth that was also lie, that contained accurate observation wrapped in malicious interpretation, that demonstrated the hunters understood not just my memories but my psychological vulnerabilities, understood exactly which accusations would cut deepest. which guilts would paralyze most effectively, which fears would erode resistance most completely. And beneath the familiar faces, I began to see their true forms, began to perceive the reality beneath the masks they wore. They were not individual entities, but were tentacles, were extensions, were the reaching limbs of something far larger that existed in the warp and was pushing itself through the breach in multiple places simultaneously, that was using my consciousness as anchor point, as reference, as the stable location from which it could project multiple manifestations into material reality. The hunters were not separate beings pursuing me independently. They were fingers of a hand, were aspects of unified consciousness, were the distributed attention of something so vast that manifesting in totality would require breach far larger than single-marked human could provide, but which could extend tendrils, could reach through in pieces, could surround and confine and torment prey through multiplicity, even while maintaining singular purpose. I felt my sanity peeling away as their voices mimicked my family, my overseers, my own thoughts. The boundary between internal dialogue and external speech dissolved, eroded by the constant assault of voices that sounded like my consciousness talking to itself but which carried intentions I did not choose, that broadcast thoughts I did not think, that demonstrated my skull was no longer sealed container for private experience, but was permeable, was accessible, was space that the hunters could invade as easily as they invaded physical space, perhaps more easily because consciousness was their native medium, was the substance they were made from, was the realm where they possessed advantage that matter-based defenses could not contest. "You're afraid of being alone," one voice whispered, indistinguishable from my own internal monologue, "but you're also afraid of connection. You're afraid of dying, but you're also afraid of continuing to exist in circumstances that make existence torture. You're afraid of being consumed, but you're also afraid of being ignored, of dying without significance, of suffering without meaning. You contain contradictions that paralyze you, that prevent decisive action, that make you perfect prey, because you cannot commit to resistance or surrender, cannot choose fight or flight, cannot do anything except continue in this liminal state of being, almost taken, almost consumed, almost dead, but never quite crossing the threshold that would resolve your suffering one way or another." The voice was right. I recognized the truth in its accusations, recognized that my paralysis was not purely external, was not solely product of being hunted, but was also internal failure, was my own psychological fragmentation, was the accumulated damage of months spent in fear so extreme that it had rewired my consciousness, had created patterns of thought that served the hunter's purpose better than my own survival, that made me complicit in my own predation, that transformed me from victim into accomplice in the slow dismantling of myself. I could no longer tell which footsteps were mine and which belonged to something wearing my shape, something following me through the tunnels, something that looked identical from behind, that cast the same shadow, that moved with the same gait because it had studied me so thoroughly, had observed me so completely, had recorded every detail of my physical presence, and could now replicate it with precision that made distinguishing original from copy impossible. I would catch glimpses of myself in the reflections cast by puddles, would see my own form moving through distant passages, would hear my own voice calling from directions I was not facing, and I understood that the hunters were not just pursuing me, but were surrounding me with versions of myself, were creating environment where every presence was potential predator, where paranoia was justified and appropriate and still insufficient because the threats were more numerous, more pervasive, more impossible to defend against than paranoia could encompass. Their pursuit grew tighter, more claustrophobic, more suffocating with each turn I took. The tunnels themselves seemed to be conspiring, seemed to be narrowing, seemed to be channeling me toward some central location, some focal point where the breach was strongest, where the boundary between realms was thinnest, where the hunters could finally complete the harvest that had been their purpose since the moment they first noticed me noticing them, since the moment when hunter and prey established the connection that made the hunt possible, necessary, inevitable. I felt them pressing against my consciousness from all sides, felt their presence no longer external but internal, felt them occupying space inside my mind that should have been private, should have been protected, should have been the last refuge where self could retreat and remain intact. They were not just surrounding me physically, they were infiltrating me psychologically, were replacing my thoughts with their thoughts, were overwriting my identity with patterns that served their purpose, were transforming me from autonomous consciousness into puppet, into vessel, into the shell they would wear when the extraction was complete, when my consciousness had been removed and something else had been installed in its place. The realization should have terrified me, should have provoked resistance, should have triggered survival response, should have mobilized whatever psychological reserves remained to fight this final invasion. But I felt nothing, or felt everything simultaneously, felt emotions that cancelled each other into paralysis, into acceptance, into the recognition that fighting was pointless when the battle had already been lost, when the war had been over before it began, when the only variable was how long I prolonged the inevitable conclusion that had been determined the moment the hunters marked me as theirs. I heard laughter echoing through the tunnels, dozens of voices laughing in unison, hundreds perhaps, the accumulated mockery of all the manifestations that hunted me, that had multiplied from one to legion, that had transformed my individual predator into distributed network of attention, into swarm, into the inevitable consequence of being marked, not by individual demon, but by something larger, something that possessed resources to deploy multiple aspects simultaneously, something that found entertainment not in quick kill but in prolonged terror, in the elaborate choreography of pursuit and capture that would culminate in harvest that was both execution and transformation, both ending and terrible beginning. The tunnel terminated in chamber I did not remember entering, space that was too large for the maintenance system's documented architecture, space that contained more volume than should exist within the hive's known structure. The walls were covered in marks, the same marks that had appeared on my hab unit walls, the same scratches that had multiplied across every surface I inhabited, but here they were in such density that the walls appeared to be made of them, appeared to be constructed entirely from scored metal and carved stone, appeared to be solid manifestation of the language the hunters used, the script they wrote in boundaries between worlds, the text that described their claims and purposes, and the particular satisfaction they derived from methodical dismantling of consciousness that believed itself protected by flesh, by faith, by the Imperium's promises that proved hollow when tested against forces that existed beyond Imperial jurisdiction. The hunters were already there, all of them simultaneously, dozens of manifestations arranged around the chamber's perimeter, like audience at theater, like witnesses at execution, like congregation at religious ceremony, where I was simultaneously sacrifice and celebrant, victim and participant, offering and priest. They wore faces I recognized and faces I did not, wore forms that were approximately human, and forms that abandoned any pretense of humanity, wore shapes that flickered between states, that could not maintain consistency, because consistency required existing in single state, and they existed in multiple states simultaneously, occupied multiple positions in space-time, were here and elsewhere and in all the spaces between. In the chamber's center was aperture, not physical opening but dimensional breach, not hole in wall but tear in reality itself, not absence but presence of something else, of somewhere else, of the realm beyond the veil made visible, made accessible, made ready to receive what had been marked and claimed and hunted across months of terror and flight and failed refuge. The aperture pulsed with light that was also darkness, with colors that hurt to perceive because they existed outside visible spectrum, with geometries that violated every principle of spatial relationship I had learned, that demonstrated mathematics was not universal constant, but was local framework that described this reality, but failed completely to describe other realities, failed to encompass realms where consciousness rather than matter was primary substance, where thought could become form and desire could reshape existence, and where the hunters lived in their native element, in medium where they possessed advantages I could not contest, could not escape, could not survive, except through transformation so complete that survival would be meaningless, because what survived would not be me, would not be Corvus Thane, would not be human in any sense that word retained meaning. They closed in all the manifestations simultaneously, moving toward me, toward the center, toward the aperture where I stood frozen, where my body had ceased responding to commands, where autonomy had ended and what remained was merely biological machinery completing its final processes before shutdown, before harvest, before extraction of the consciousness that had animated it, that had made it person rather than meat, that had distinguished Corvus Thane from simple collection of organic compounds that happened to maintain homeostasis and exhibited complex behaviors that mimicked intelligence without requiring consciousness. Their voices overlapped into chorus, into cacophony, into symphony of malice and hunger and satisfaction that was almost sexual, was almost religious, was the ecstasy of purpose achieved, of hunt concluded, of prey finally cornered and claimed after investment of months, after patience that spanned subjective eternities in realm where time was negotiable, after entertainment that would be remembered and revisited and savored in the endless now of their existence beyond the veil. "You ran well," they said in unison, their voices merging into single voice that contained multitudes, that spoke with authority of legion, that announced judgment that was final and absolute. "You provided sport. You flavored your terror with hope and desperation, and the particular anguish of intelligent prey that understands its fate but cannot accept it, cannot surrender even when surrender is the only rational response, cannot stop trying to find meaning in suffering that has no meaning except the entertainment it provides to those who watch, who hunt, who feed on the exquisite complexity of consciousness destroying itself through futile resistance to inevitable conclusion. You are ours. You have always been ours. And now comes the moment when you learn what being ours truly means, when you discover that capture is not ending but transformation, that harvest is not death but translation, that the self you defended so desperately will be preserved not as mercy but as cruelty, will be kept intact and aware throughout the consumption that follows, throughout the endless processing of your consciousness in realm where screaming lasts forever because time is what we make it, because suffering is currency we trade, because your terror is resource we will mine eternally, drawing from the well of your awareness, experiences and emotions and sensations that will never deplete, because we will ensure you never empty, never numb, never escape into the mercy of dissolution or madness or death. They reached toward me with appendages that were not hands, with extensions that were not limbs, with the manifold attention of distributed consciousness that had surrounded me completely, that had closed every gap, that had eliminated every possibility except surrender, except acceptance, except the final moment when resistance would end and the taking would begin, and I would discover what existed beyond the boundary I had spent months fleeing toward, that I had been herded toward by hunters whose purpose was not just to catch but to transform, not just to kill but to preserve in states that made death seem merciful, made extinction seem desirable, made the void seem preferable to the eternal awareness they promised. The consciousness without escape, that would be my reward for having been noticed, for having been marked, for having been chosen from among billions to serve as entertainment, as sustenance, as the particular delicacy that aware suffering provided to appetites that could never be satisfied, but could always be fed. The aperture opened wider. Reality thinned to translucency, and I felt myself being pulled toward it, through it, beyond it, felt the boundary dissolving, felt the last barrier between here and elsewhere collapsing, felt consciousness being separated from flesh in process that was not death but was translation, was the forcible relocation of awareness from realm where it belonged to realm where it would be forever alien, forever vulnerable, forever prey in environment designed specifically to maximize suffering, to extend terror, to ensure that the harvest would continue indefinitely because the hunters did not consume and discard but consumed and preserved, kept their prey conscious and aware throughout digestion that was eternal, throughout processing that never ended, throughout the transformation that would make me theirs not just temporarily but forever, not just in this moment but in all moments. Not just as victim, but as eternal testament to what happened when consciousness was foolish enough to notice the things that watched from beyond the veil, foolish enough to acknowledge their presence, foolish enough to create the connection that allowed them to mark, to claim, to hunt, to take. I screamed, or tried to scream, but my voice was not mine anymore, was not under my control, belonged to them already, had been claimed as everything else would be claimed, as my memories and identity and the core of whatever made me person rather than mechanism, as the self I had tried so desperately to protect would be harvested and displayed and used as they saw fit, as would serve their purpose, as would provide them entertainment that would last until they tired of me, until the well ran dry, until they had extracted every possible permutation of suffering and moved on to new prey, new hunt, new entertainment that would repeat the cycle eternally, because the hunters were eternal and the prey was infinite, and the veil between worlds was thin enough that breaches could happen anywhere, anytime. To anyone who made the mistake of noticing the eyes in the darkness, the scratches on the walls, the watching that never stopped. This was what it meant to be hunted to the end. This was the conclusion. This was the moment when the warp claimed its marked prey and demonstrated that the Imperium's protection was illusion, that faith was insufficient, that no power in material universe could contest the claim once it had been properly established through months of careful preparation, through patient stalking, through the methodical erosion of hope that transformed prey from fighter into supplicant, from refugee into sacrifice, from human into offering to powers that existed beyond humanity, beyond mercy, beyond any framework that made suffering bearable or death a release. The hunters multiplied around me until I could not distinguish between them, until they merged into wall of presence, into solid manifestation of attention and hunger and purpose that was absolute. And then they took me. I found refuge in a forgotten chapel deep in the underhive, though refuge is too generous a word for what I found, too hopeful a concept for what that space represented. I did not escape the chamber where the hunters had surrounded me. I do not remember how I departed, do not recall the transition from being seized to being released, do not know whether I fled or was allowed to flee, whether my continued existence represented failure on their part or success, whether I was prey that had somehow eluded capture or prey that had been marked for longer torment, for the particular entertainment that came from watching consciousness realize that escape was temporary, that every refuge was merely way station on road to inevitable conclusion. The chapel was a ruin, was the corpse of faith left to rot in the underhive's deepest levels, where even the ecclesiarchy had abandoned pretense of ministry, where the emperor's attention was theoretical rather than practical, where worship had been replaced by survival and devotion by the desperate pragmatism that characterized life in spaces the Imperium had written off as acceptable loss. The structure was ancient, predated the current hive configuration by centuries perhaps, had been built during some earlier phase of the planet's development, and then had been buried as construction continued upward, as successive generations built higher and left the lower levels to darkness and decay, and those who had no choice except to inhabit spaces that had been abandoned by everything except despair. The icons were cracked, their faces weathered into abstraction, their identities lost to time and neglect, and the slow dissolution that claimed all material things in environments where humidity and chemical contamination accelerated decay beyond what maintenance could prevent. The aquila mounted above the altar had lost one head entirely, the remaining head tilted at angle that suggested not watchfulness but exhaustion, not vigilance but defeat, not protection but the acknowledgement that protection had failed, had always failed, had been illusion maintained through collective agreement to ignore evidence that faith was insufficient against forces that operated beyond faith's jurisdiction. The chapel wept rust, the walls were covered in it, oxidation seeping from metal panels and support beams, creating patterns that resembled dried blood, that suggested violence rather than mere corrosion, that made the space feel less like sanctuary and more like crime scene, like location where terrible things had occurred and would occur again because terrible things were attracted to spaces that had already been violated, were drawn to weakness, to cracks in reality's foundation, to places where the boundary between worlds had worn thin through accumulated suffering, through centuries of desperate prayers that went unanswered, through the psychic residue of millions who had sought refuge and found only temporary delay before whatever they fled caught them anyway. I barricaded the entrance with everything I could move, broken pews whose wood had rotted until it crumbled under pressure, chunks of ferrocrete that had fallen from the ceiling, pieces of debris whose original purpose was unidentifiable but whose mass was sufficient to create barrier, to establish physical boundary, even though I knew physical boundaries were meaningless against what hunted me, even though I understood that doors and walls and barricades were theater, were psychological comfort rather than actual defense. Were the human need to create barriers manifesting in futile gesture against forces that existed in dimensions where barriers were concepts rather than constraints? But I barricaded anyway because doing nothing was worse than doing something futile, because activity created illusion of agency, because building the barrier allowed me to focus on concrete task rather than on the abstract horror of knowing the hunters were coming, were tracking me through senses I did not possess, were closing distance with patience that was infinite, because they existed outside time's flow, because they experienced duration differently than material consciousness, because minutes or hours or days were equally meaningless to entities that measured existence in epochs rather than heartbeats. I worked in darkness, broken only by bioluminescent fungi that grew in the chapel's dampest corners, their pale light barely sufficient for navigation, but better than absolute darkness that suggested not just absence of illumination, but presence of something that consumed light, that ate photons, that made darkness active rather than passive. The fungi pulsed faintly, rhythmically, and I recognized the rhythm. It matched my heartbeat, matched the pulse I had first perceived in the Manufactorum tunnels months ago, matched the signature of the things that hunted me, and I understood that even here, even in this forgotten space, their presence was already manifest, was already infiltrating, was already preparing the environment for breach. For the final confrontation that would not be confrontation, because confrontation implied opposition between relative equals, and I was not equal, had never been equal, had been marked as prey from the beginning, and prey did not contest predator. Prey only fled until flight became impossible, and then experienced whatever fate predator chose to bestow. The barricade grew. I worked for hours. My chronometer had ceased functioning, its display showing only static, but my body's exhaustion suggested hours had passed, suggested physical effort sustained beyond normal endurance, suggested I was operating on reserves that would soon deplete completely. I stacked debris until the entrance was sealed, until no gap remained, until the barrier was solid mass of material that would prevent entry, would create obstacle, would force anything attempting entrance to reveal itself through the sound and effort of breaking through. But as I placed the final piece, as I sealed the last gap, I heard them on the other side. Not footsteps. The hunters did not walk in ways that created standard acoustic signatures, but presence, weight, the sensation of multiple entities occupying space beyond the barricade, pressing against it, testing it, analyzing its structure and composition, and the particular psychological investment I had made in constructing it, learning exactly how to violate it in ways that would maximize my terror, that would demonstrate not just that barriers failed, but that the effort of building them had been observed, had been anticipated, had been incorporated into entertainment they derived from Hunt's conclusion. I heard scratching. The sound that had announced their presence in the beginning, the sound that had marked walls and floors, and eventually my own skin. The sound that was their signature, their calling card, their announcement that they were present, were active, were preparing to cross from their realm to mine. The scratching came from multiple locations simultaneously, from the door's surface, from the walls on either side, from the ceiling above, from the floor beneath, from dimensions that intersected with three-dimensional space in ways that created geometric impossibilities that human consciousness strained to process and failed, that made location meaningless because they could scratch from everywhere simultaneously, could exist in all positions around and through and within the space I occupied. Unseen claws scraped across the barricade's outer surface, their movement creating sounds that should not result from contact between physical objects, that suggested their claws were not matter, as I understood matter, but were something else, were extensions of will given temporary physicality, were the manifestation of intention to breach, to enter, to claim, to finally complete the harvest that had been postponed but never prevented, that had been delayed but never abandoned, that was arriving with the terrible inevitability of entropy, of gravity, of any natural process that could be resisted temporarily but never defeated permanently. The doors bulged inward. The barricade I had built, the barrier I had invested hours constructing, began to deform under pressure that came not just from outside but from within, from the wood and metal and stone itself, responding to presence that did not push physically but pushed metaphysically, that exerted force on the material's essential nature rather than on its surface, that made solid things soft, made barriers permeable, made boundaries negotiable through the simple application of will that was stronger than physics, that operated under rules where consciousness, rather than matter, was primary substance. I backed away from the buckling entrance, retreated toward the chapel's rear where the altar stood, where the broken Aquila watched with its single remaining head, where the icons of saints whose names had been worn away by time observed with cracked faces that might have been compassion or might have been mockery, that might have represented the emperor's acknowledgement of my suffering or his complete indifference to individual fate, his focus remaining on strategic scales where planets and sectors and entire crusades were tactical considerations, but individual humans were merely statistical noise, were casualties too numerous to mourn, were losses too constant to register, except as numbers in ledgers that measured the Imperium's slow collapse or continuation, depending on which data you emphasized, which metrics you chose to track. My heartbeat pounded loud enough that I feared it would become a beacon, would advertise my location as clearly as if I had been shouting coordinates, would draw the hunters with precision that rendered concealment pointless. And perhaps it did, perhaps my elevated heart rate created perturbations in local reality, created ripples in dimensions I could not perceive, created signals that the hunters could detect and follow with accuracy that transcended physical senses, that allowed them to track prey through the very biology that sustained prey, through the involuntary processes that made hiding impossible because you could not stop your heart from beating without dying, and dying was what they wanted to prevent because death was escape, and escape was mercy, and mercy was not part of their vocabulary, not concept they acknowledged, not consideration that factored into their purpose, which was not to kill but to preserve, not to end but to extend, not to grant release but to ensure awareness continued indefinitely throughout whatever processing awaited beyond the veil. The air chilled, not gradually. The temperature dropped precipitously, instantly, as if all thermal energy had been extracted from the space simultaneously, as if heat itself had been forbidden from existing in proximity to what approached. My breath misted, hung visible in air that was too cold for the underhive's usual temperatures, that suggested environment was being rewritten, was being transformed to suit the hunter's nature rather than mine, was becoming space where they were comfortable and I was vulnerable, where their substance was stable and mine was fragile, where the advantage they possessed in their native realm was being imported into material reality through the simple expedient of making material reality resemble immaterial reality, of making here resemble elsewhere, of eroding distinction between dimensions until the boundary dissolved completely and everything became the same, became their territory, became hunting ground where prey had no refuge, because refuge required distinction between safe and unsafe spaces, and such distinctions no longer existed. Reality thinned. I felt it as physical sensation, as if the air had become less substantial, as if gravity had weakened, as if the fundamental forces that govern material existence were being diluted, were being mixed with something else, were being contaminated by the presence of realm where different forces governed, where physics was suggestion rather than law, where matter and consciousness were not separate categories, but were aspects of same underlying reality that could be manipulated through will, through intention, through the focused attention of entities that had existed for eternities and had learned to treat reality as medium to be shaped rather than as constraint to be obeyed. Light guttered. The bioluminescent fungi that had provided minimal illumination began to dim, their glow fading not because they were dying but because light itself was having difficulty existing in space, that was being invaded by darkness, that was not absence but presence, that was substance rather than void. That was the material of the hunter's realm made manifest in mine, that demonstrated darkness was not merely lack of photons but was actual thing, actual force, actual presence that could displace light the way water displaced air, that could fill space and make that space inhospitable to anything that required illumination to function. I felt the hunters whispering through the walls, their voices not vibrating the physical structure but vibrating something else, some medium that occupied the same space as physical matter but was not physical matter, that existed in dimensions where sound propagated differently, where communication occurred through mechanisms that bypassed ears and speech and all the standard apparatus of human language. They spoke directly to consciousness, broadcasted into my awareness with clarity that was terrible, that demonstrated my skull was not protection, that my thoughts were not private, that the innermost spaces of my identity were accessible to them as easily as external space, perhaps more easily because consciousness was their native medium, was the substance they were made from, was the realm where they possessed advantage that matter-based consciousness could never contest. "We're here," they whispered, and the whisper came from everywhere simultaneously, came from the walls and floor and ceiling, came from the air itself, came from inside my own skull as if I was speaking to myself, as if my internal voice had been hijacked, as if the boundary between my thoughts and their communication had dissolved completely. "We've always been here. We were here before you arrived, have been waiting in this space for centuries, for millennia, for the eternal now that is our existence. This chapel was consecrated to your emperor but was never his, was always ours, was built on ground that belonged to us before humans existed, before your species crawled from primordial ooze, and pretended consciousness made you special, made you protected, made you anything except another form of meat that happened to be aware of its own consumption. You chose this place as refuge, but you chose wrong, chose well, chose exactly as we wanted you to choose because we herded you here, guided your flight through careful application of fear and exhaustion and the systematic elimination of alternatives until this was the only destination remaining, until you arrived exactly where we wanted you, exactly when we wanted you, exactly as we wanted you, alone, terrified, exhausted, broken, ready for harvest. The barricade collapsed. Not from the hunters breaking through. They did not need to break through, did not need to apply force, did not need to overcome physical obstacle because physical obstacles were irrelevant to entities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The barrier simply ceased to exist, ceased to be solid, ceased to provide separation between inside and outside, because inside and outside were losing distinction, were merging into single continuous space, where location was meaningless and boundaries were illusions, and the chapel that had seemed like sanctuary revealed itself as trap, as cage, as carefully prepared environment where the final act of hunt would occur under conditions the hunters controlled completely. They entered, all of them simultaneously, dozens of manifestations flooding through the entrance that was no longer blocked, that was open despite the barricade that still physically existed but no longer functioned as barrier because function required obeying rules, and the rules were being rewritten in real time, were being altered to permit entry, to allow passage, to ensure that nothing prevented them from reaching me, from surrounding me, from beginning the final process that had been postponed for so long, that had been extended to maximize entertainment, but which was now reaching its inevitable conclusion. I saw their forms clearly for the first time, saw them without the filters that consciousness normally applied, without the protective distortions that allowed material minds to perceive immaterial entities, without immediately fracturing from incomprehensibility. They were beautiful and terrible simultaneously, were geometries that should not exist but did, were configurations of limbs and surfaces and organs that served no biological function but existed for aesthetic purposes, for the pleasure of form itself, for the demonstration that shape could be chosen rather than determined by evolution, that appearance could be art rather than adaptation, that consciousness unbound by flesh could wear whatever forms pleased it, could shift between states as mood dictated, could be liquid and solid and gaseous, and none of those things simultaneously. But beneath the beauty was hunger, was intention, was purpose that was absolute and unyielding. They were predators in most fundamental sense, were entities whose existence was defined by consumption, by the processing of other consciousness, by the transformation of separate awareness into sustenance, into entertainment, into the particular satisfaction that came from possessing something completely, from owning not just body but soul, not just matter but meaning, not just organism but the organized information that made organism into person rather than mere biological machinery. They closed around me as I pressed my back against the altar, as I grabbed the broken aquila and held it before me like weapon, like shield, like religious symbol that might possess power, might channel faith, might manifest the emperor's protection that theology promised but which I had never witnessed, had never experienced, had been taught to believe in despite absence of evidence, because faith required belief without proof, and proof would make faith unnecessary, and faith was what sustained imperium, what justified suffering, What allowed billions to continue existing in circumstances that were objectively intolerable, except through conviction that suffering served purpose, that pain had meaning, that every death contributed to grand strategy that transcended individual understanding. But the Aquila provided no protection. The hunters regarded it with curiosity rather than fear, with interest rather than reverence, with the attention of beings examining artifact from alien culture, object whose significance was understood intellectually but held no power, created no barrier, manifested no divine intervention because divinity either did not exist or did not care, or cared only for aggregates rather than individuals, cared only for species rather than specimens, cared only for Imperium's continuation rather than for the constituent souls whose suffering sustained that continuation. One of them reached toward me, extended appendage that was approximately hand-shaped but possessed too many joints, too many fingers, configuration that suggested human anatomy but violated it in ways that made the similarity more disturbing than if it had been completely alien. The hand thing touched the Aquila I held, touched it gently, almost reverently, and the metal began to corrode, began to rust, began to dissolve under contact with something whose touch carried entropy, carried decay, carried the opposite of blessing, carried curse that was not active malevolence but was simple consequence of immaterial consciousness contacting material object, of two incompatible states, meeting and creating friction that manifested as accelerated breakdown, as the transformation of ordered matter into disordered matter, as the demonstration that faith symbols possessed no intrinsic power, that their significance was purely psychological, that they worked only when wielder believed they worked and ceased working the moment belief wavered, the moment doubt entered, the moment consciousness acknowledged that the symbol was just metal, just representation, just cultural artifact, rather than conduit for divine power. The Aquila crumbled in my hands, disintegrated into rust and dust, fell away leaving me holding nothing, left me defenseless, not because defense had been breached, but because defense had been revealed as never existing, as having been psychological comfort rather than actual protection, as having been lie. I told myself to make the hunt bearable, to make being prey tolerable, to maintain fiction that resistance was possible when resistance had never been possible, when outcome had been determined from beginning, when the hunt's conclusion had been written before hunt began. They promised that my soul would scream forever once they seized it. Not threatened, promised, as if my eternal suffering was gift, was reward, was the natural conclusion to existence that had been meaningful specifically because it would be remembered, would be preserved, would continue indefinitely in forms that transcended death, that made extinction impossible, that ensured whatever I was would never be allowed to end because ending was mercy, and mercy was not part of their nature, was not concept they understood, was not consideration that factored into their purpose, which was preservation rather than destruction, was eternal processing rather than clean death, was the transformation of finite suffering into infinite awareness of suffering, was the demonstration that being prey did not end with capture but was merely beginning, was transition from being hunted to being possessed, from being pursued to being owned, from experiencing fear to becoming fear itself, to being transformed into sustenance that could be consumed perpetually without depletion, because consumption would regenerate what it consumed, would ensure the victim remained intact throughout processing that lasted forever. The chapel walls rippled like water, the altar beneath my back softened, the floor lost solidity, and I understood that the last door would not close, could not close, had never been able to close, because doors required boundaries, and boundaries required distinction between here and there, and such distinctions were dissolving, were being erased, were being rendered meaningless, as the hunters completed their invasion, not just of space but of meaning itself, not just of location but of the categories that made location comprehensible, not just of my body but of the framework that made embodiment possible. They reached for me with manifold appendages, with distributed attention, with the focused intention of entities that had waited months for this moment, that had invested substantial effort in preparation, that would now harvest what they had cultivated, would reap what they had sown, would claim what they had marked as theirs from the beginning. And I, pressed against altar that was no longer solid, holding symbol that had dissolved into dust, existing in space that was no longer material reality but was transition zone between dimensions, could only scream as the final door failed to close, as the last barrier fell, as the boundary between self and other dissolved and the taking began. I write these final words as the chapel walls ripple like water around me, as the solid becomes fluid, as matter reveals itself as illusion, as everything I believed about the nature of reality dissolves into the truth that consciousness is primary and matter is merely consciousness. Believing in its own solidity, believing in boundaries that do not exist, believing in the fiction of separation between self and other, between here and elsewhere, between material realm and the spaces that exist behind, beneath, beyond the comfortable three dimensions that human perception mistakes for totality, when totality is so much vaster, so much more terrible, so much more incomprehensible than the narrow band of existence we evolved to perceive. My hands move across a surface that might be the chapel floor, or might be my own skin, or might be the fabric of reality itself, and symbols appear that might be low Gothic script or might be something else entirely, might be the language that the hunters write in the boundaries between dimensions, might be the text that describes my own consumption, might be autobiography written by the universe itself, documenting this moment when one more consciousness crossed the threshold from material existence into the spaces where material existence was revealed as temporary state, as larval form, as the cocoon that must be shed before transformation into something more permanent, more aware, more absolutely trapped in states that made physical imprisonment seem liberating by comparison. Time stutters. I experience this moment, this eternal moment of being taken from multiple perspectives simultaneously. I am writing these words now. I have always been writing these words. I will never stop writing these words. The act of documentation is not sequential but is continuous, present, is eternal now that the hunters inhabit, is the state where past and future collapse into singular experience that contains all possibilities, all outcomes, all versions of this moment, stretched across infinite variations, each equally real, each equally experienced, each equally inescapable. Seconds repeat. I feel myself reaching for the pen or stylus or claw that carves these symbols, feel the motion happening once and then happening again, feel time looping back on itself, feel causality becoming circular rather than linear, feel the comfortable progression of before, during, after breaking down into something else, into pattern that spirals rather than advances, that returns to beginning even while moving toward end, that demonstrates past is not fixed and future is not open, but both are states that exist simultaneously, that can be occupied together, that make the concept of sequence meaningless because sequence requires time to flow in single direction and time is not flowing anymore. Time has become still water, has become frozen moment, has become the trap where consciousness remains aware but cannot progress, cannot escape, cannot do anything except experience this eternal now of being taken, of being pulled through threshold into realm where duration is meaningless and moments last forever. I watch myself from outside my body, from perspective that should not be possible, from position that occupies same space as my physical form but is not anchored in that form. Is consciousness experiencing itself from multiple locations simultaneously? I see my hands moving, see symbols appearing on surface that shifts between identities, see my face contorted in expression that might be terror, or might be ecstasy, or might be the recognition that terror and ecstasy are not opposites, but are aspects of same overwhelming experience, are the response of consciousness, encountering stimulus too intense for standard emotional categories, too absolute for binary classifications of positive and negative, pleasant and unpleasant, desired and feared. The hunter's hands, if hands they are, if that word retains meaning for appendages that exist in more dimensions than three, that possess more joints than human anatomy permits, that terminate in extensions that are simultaneously fingers and claws and tendrils and concepts of touch given temporary.